Section 1. The Gambling Society Below the Strip Vault 21 in the House That Robert Built. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city built on neon light and the rolling of dice. A quiet that doesn't announce itself, but drifts in slowly, the way smoke from a cigarette curls toward the ceiling of a dim room and spreads until the whole space smells of something old. Las Vegas, or what remains of it in the world of Fallout, is a city held together by the force of one man's obsession, and beneath its polished streets, beneath the carefully maintained glamour and the hum of generators and Securitrons, there are secrets that predate even the apocalypse itself. Vault 21 is not like the other vaults. That much is obvious the moment you step onto the New Vegas Strip, because it isn't hidden. It's right there, its distinctive orange and gray exterior converted into a hotel and gift shop, its residents carrying on as though the Great War was just an unpleasant afternoon 2 centuries ago, and the world had largely moved on. But look a little deeper, and you start to find that almost nothing about Vault 21 is what it seems. Let's begin with the experiment itself. Vault-Tec, the shadowy corporation that built and oversaw the vaults, was not primarily in the business of saving people. That much becomes apparent when you study the sheer variety of horrors they engineered into their bunkers. Some vaults had one man sealed inside with 999 women. Some vaults opened their doors after 6 months, while others were designed to never open at all. Some vaults ran on no electricity. Some were flooded with hallucinogens. These weren't accidental oversights. They were experiments, carefully designed under the label of the Societal Preservation Program, a phrase that sounds reassuringly academic until you understand that most of the preservation being done was the preservation of data, and most of the data was extracted from the suffering of the people locked inside. Vault 21's experiment was different in character, if not necessarily in cruelty. Every conflict, every disagreement, every resource allocation, every leadership decision, every relationship was to be resolved by gambling. Pure chance. Pure luck. Who gets the last ration? Flip a card. Who leads? Roll the dice. Who gets the larger sleeping quarters? Play a hand. The entire social fabric of this underground society was woven from luck and probability, and for a remarkably long time, it actually worked. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs counter to almost every assumption we make about how societies function. We assume that shared values create cohesion, or hierarchy, or maybe raw power, the strong taking from the weak, as they have always done. Vault 21 offered something different, a pure meritocracy of probability, where your station in life could change at any moment based on the turn of a card. And the people inside it, over time, became extraordinarily skilled gamblers. Not because they were taught to be, but because their survival depended on it. Every resident of Vault 21 was, over generations, shaped by the pressure of that experiment into someone who understood odds and risk on an almost instinctual level. The Vault's most famous resident, the one who would eventually come to define its post-war legacy, is Sarah. Sarah ran Vault 21 in its converted hotel form, and she's one of those characters who carries the whole weight of the Vault's history in the way she talks about it. She loved that place. She genuinely loved it, not as a survivor loves the shelter that kept them alive, but the way you love a home that shaped who you are. And when you discover what Robert House did to the Vault, you understand why her grief is so particular, so personal. Robert House is perhaps the most fascinating figure on the Strip, and possibly in the entire Fallout universe. A pre-war billionaire, a visionary, a man who calculated the exact date of the nuclear exchange to within 2 hours, and who managed to survive by essentially putting himself into a kind of extended technological hibernation, while his city was protected by a network of defensive systems he'd spent decades and billions of dollars building. House is old, and he is patient, and he is ruthless in ways that are rarely dramatic but consistently devastating. By the time the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion are fighting over the Hoover Dam, House has already been quietly repositioning his pieces on the board for 200 years. When House turned his attention to Vault 21, he did what House always does. He played the long game. He challenged the Vault's residents to a series of gambling sessions, and he won. He won so comprehensively, so decisively, that he won ownership of the Vault itself. And then, having won, he did something that reveals the particular coldness at the center of his personality. He had the Vault's contents sealed, filled with concrete, buried. The entire lower section, the living quarters, the experimental chambers, The infrastructure that the vault's community had built over generations, all of it was entombed. The surface was kept as a hotel to generate revenue and maintain an asset. The history was buried. Sarah knows this. She still lives there. She tends the hotel and the gift shop, and she doesn't talk about what happened. Not really, but it's in everything she says if you know how to listen for it. The vault was her life, and House turned it into a set piece. She is the caretaker of a tomb wearing the face of a hotel. But here's where the mystery deepens, and it's the kind of mystery that rewards quiet attention. Why did House want Vault 21 specifically? He has his own casino, the Lucky 38, the crown jewel of the Strip, a place of legendary exclusivity and considerable strategic importance. He doesn't need another revenue stream. He doesn't need a hotel. So why go to the trouble of challenging the Vault's residents, winning it through gambling on their own terms, and then sealing the lower levels? The most compelling answer involves the tunnel network beneath Vault 21. The vaults were not isolated structures. They were connected, in some cases, by underground passages that served various logistical and strategic purposes before the war. The tunnels beneath Vault 21 are extensive, and if House knew or suspected what those tunnels connected to, that would give him a reason that had nothing to do with revenue. It would give him a reason that had everything to do with control. There's another angle that the game's cut content hints at but never fully confirms. Before the war, House was the CEO of Robco Industries, and Robco had extensive dealings with Vault Tech. The exact nature of those dealings is murky, but there's reason to believe that House had access to Vault Tech's internal records, their research protocols, their experimental data, the technical specifications of their various projects. If Vault 21's experiment produced results that interested House, if 2 centuries of a gambling-based society created something that his actuarial mind found useful, the data from that experiment would be worth considerable effort to retrieve. And the only way to retrieve it cleanly, without anyone else knowing what you were looking for, would be to own the whole structure. Consider also that House's entire plan for the future of humanity involves radical social engineering. He wants to rebuild civilization according to his design, and part of that design involves understanding how societies actually function under pressure. A working society that resolved all conflicts through probability is an extraordinarily interesting data point. It means that luck, properly institutionalized, can actually serve as a functional social contract. That's not a small insight. That's the kind of insight that shapes governance. And yet House sealed the vault. He didn't mine it for data, or if he did it quietly and then buried the evidence. There is something he didn't want anyone else to find. The question that the game leaves unanswered deliberately, because the best mysteries are the ones that invite your mind to keep working, even when the story has moved on, is what was in the lower sections of Vault 21 that warranted entombment rather than simply exploitation. Was it the data from the experiment? Was it something the residents had built or discovered in the 2 centuries they'd spent underground? Was it something in the tunnel network that connected to something House needed to stay hidden? Sarah can't tell you, or won't. House won't discuss it. The terminals in the sealed sections of the vault give hints but no conclusions. The concrete filling the lower chambers has done what concrete always does. It has preserved and silenced in equal measure. There's a particular texture to the mystery of Vault 21 that feels different from most Fallout mysteries, and I think it comes from the fact that the experiment there actually produced something that worked. Most Vault experiments are case studies in failure, sometimes spectacular, sometimes mundane, always grim. But a society that genuinely organized itself around gambling, that developed a whole culture around probability and risk and the acceptance of chance outcomes, is a society that found a solution to conflict that doesn't involve violence or hierarchy or ideology. It's messy and strange and deeply human, and it lasted 2 centuries underground. And then a man in a penthouse sealed it up because he wanted something from its bones. The Strip buzzes around Vault 21 like nothing happened. Tourists, well, not tourists exactly, but wanderers and couriers and the various soldiers and settlers of this desert world walk past the hotel entrance and buy irradiated novelties from Sarah's gift shop and think nothing of it. They don't know they're standing on top of a buried world. They don't know that the woman behind the counter is grieving something she'll never get back. They don't know that in the sealed darkness below their feet, somewhere beneath the layers of concrete and history, there may still be answers to questions that only one man thought to ask. That's the texture of the Fallout world when it's working at its best. Not spectacle, not shock, but the slow accumulation of small, quiet losses. A vault sealed. A woman left behind. A city that learned to gamble on everything except the things that actually mattered. The dice stopped rolling in Vault 21 the day House came to play. And whatever he found when he won, he's never told a soul. Hey, before we move on, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Seriously, I love seeing where people are tuning in from when they're trying to drift off. And if the vibe is hitting just right, the subscribe button is right there. Now, let's keep going. Number. Section 2. The Man Who Wouldn't Die. Joshua Graham and the Weight of the Grand Canyon. There are stories that exist in the space between myth and biography, where it becomes impossible to separate the person from the legend they've become, because the legend is the only form the person has left to inhabit. Joshua Graham is one of those stories. He was born in New Canaan, a settlement in what used to be Ogden, Utah, in a world that still used words like settlement and used to be, because the old words hadn't been replaced yet by anything that fit better. New Canaan was a Mormon community, and Joshua Graham grew up in the particular cadence of that faith, the emphasis on scripture, on community, on language, on the idea that the right words spoken in the right order carry a kind of weight that the world is obligated to take seriously. He was trained as a missionary. He was gifted with languages in a way that strikes most people as almost supernatural. He could absorb a dialect the way some people absorb light, taking it in and making it part of himself until he could speak with the locals of anywhere he visited and be taken for one of their own. That gift is what brought him to the attention of Edward Sallow. Edward Sallow arrived at the Grand Canyon as an anthropologist, part of a Followers of the Apocalypse expedition to study the tribes that had formed in the post-war Southwest. The followers are dedicated to preserving knowledge and alleviating suffering, which is an admirable mandate that attracts people of genuine idealism and considerable intellectual firepower. Sallow was one of those people, though what nobody understood at the time was that his idealism had a hidden structure to it, a skeleton of ambition that the soft tissue of academic interest was wrapped around. Sallow and Graham were captured by the Blackfoot tribe, a group losing a war against 7 rival factions simultaneously. Graham was there as a translator. And Sallow, Edward Sallow, who had spent years studying the fall of the Roman Empire and who had come to believe that the only thing wrong with Rome was that it had gone soft, had allowed sentiment to weaken the discipline that had made it great. Edward Sallow looked at the Blackfoot tribe and saw raw material. What happened next is one of the most significant events in the history of the Fallout Southwest, and it began with a translator and an anthropologist sitting in a tent making decisions that would kill tens of thousands of people over the next several decades. Sallow taught the Blackfoot tribe about guerrilla tactics, about discipline, about the power of terror as a tool of social control. He taught them how to fight and how to win, and they did. They won so decisively, absorbed so many of their defeated enemies, grew so rapidly in power and discipline and territory that within years what had been a desperate band clinging to the edge of extinction had become the seed of something that would eventually call itself Caesar's Legion. Sallow became Caesar. Graham became the Malpais Lega, the military commander of the Legion, its most feared figure, the man Caesar sent when he wanted a problem eliminated rather than managed. The Malpais legate was not cruel for the pleasure of it, or at least that's not how Joshua Graham tells it later. When there is a Joshua Graham left to do any telling at all, he was cruel in the way that a scalpel is cruel, precisely, purposefully, without hesitation or apology, because the work required it, and he was the best person available to do the work. They built an empire together, Caesar and the legate. They swept through tribe after tribe across the American Southwest, absorbing the defeated, exterminating the defiant, imposing a brutal coherence on the chaos of the post-war world. And for a long time it worked. The Legion's territory was vast, its discipline terrifying, its expansion seemingly unstoppable. Then came the First Battle of Hoover Dam in 2277, and everything changed. The new California Republic held the dam. They had Chief Hanlon on their side, a man who understood exactly how the Legion fought, who understood that the Malpais legate's greatest strength was his relentlessness, and that relentlessness has a vulnerability. It cannot adapt. Hanlon lured the Legion's forces into a series of traps, exploiting the rigidity that had made them so effective in guerrilla warfare and turning it into a fatal flaw in a conventional engagement. The Malpais legate, for all his brilliance as a battlefield commander, was not flexible in the way that the NCR's trap required someone to be flexible. He was routed. The legion retreated back to the canyon in shame. Caesar's response was immediate and absolute. Failure at the highest level of the legion demanded demonstration at the highest level. The Malpais legate was covered in pitch, set alight, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. This is the moment where Joshua Graham stops being a biography and becomes a myth. He survived. The canyon is deep over a mile in places. The fire was real. The pitch was real. The wounds were catastrophic, total body burns that should have been incompatible with continued existence by any reasonable physiological standard. And yet he crawled. He climbed. He walked, somehow, through the pain that must have been beyond any vocabulary available to the English language. He walked for 3 months, approximately 400 miles, back to New Canaan. Caesar, upon learning of this, banned the Malpais legate's very name from use within the legion. Not because he was sentimental about it. Caesar is not sentimental about anything. He banned the name because a dead man is frightening, but a man who cannot be killed is something else entirely, and that something else is dangerous to the narrative structure of any empire. You cannot build a society on the principle that Caesar's will is absolute and then have your most famous execution walking around in bandages, accepting soup from the community you spent decades trying to subjugate. The man who returned to New Canaan was not the Malpais legate. That's important to understand. Graham himself is the first to say it, and he says it with the particular honesty of someone who has spent enough time in darkness to stop pretending about what lives there. He came home, and the community welcomed him. Not cautiously, not provisionally, they welcomed him the way the New Testament describes a father welcoming the prodigal son, which is not coincidental, because Graham knows his scripture, and so do the people who wrote his dialogue. He had been their son, and then their horror, and now he was their son again, and they made no conditions. Graham came to see his survival as a second baptism. The fire had taken everything from him except the capacity to survive, and what was left when everything else was burned away was, he believed, the part of himself that God had actually wanted him to be all along. This interpretation gives the story its extraordinary quality, because it refuses to let Joshua Graham be simply a victim or simply a monster. He was, he insists, the architect of his own corruption. Every atrocity the Malpais legate committed was a choice, even when the choices accumulated so gradually that each individual step seems small. The path from missionary to war criminal is made of small compromises, and he walked every one of them with his own feet, and he knows it. By the time you encounter Joshua Graham in the Honest Hearts DLC, he has made his home in Zion Canyon, a stunning stretch of river and stone that sits in what used to be southern Utah, now home to the dead horses and the sorrows, and the various tribal groups that have built something fragile and beautiful in the shelter of the canyon's walls. He is the acting war chief of the dead horses. He is still covered in bandages. He still wears his signature armor. He carries a weapon called A Light Shining in Darkness, which is a reference to the Gospel of John, which is not accidental. The mystery of Joshua Graham is not really about what he did that's documented in blood across 100 battle sites, from the Colorado River to the Mojave. The mystery is about what's left when you strip away everything a person has built themselves into. What survives the fire, in a literal and metaphorical sense? What is the raw material of a person when all the identity they've constructed has been burned off? Graham's answer is that what survived was faith, not the comfortable, performative faith of someone who has never had reason to doubt, but the bone-deep, scarred, eyes-open faith of someone who looked into the abyss of their own worst actions and found, on the other side, something that could still be called conviction. His faith isn't gentle. It doesn't comfort easily. There's a violence in how he holds on to it, the same violence that runs through his character, generally a force that was never extinguished but has been redirected, aimed now at protecting the tribes of Zion, rather than at expanding an empire's territory. Caesar is afraid of him. That detail matters more than most players notice. Caesar, a man who has built his identity around being beyond fear, around being the inevitable force that history is bending toward, has ordered his frumentarii to kill Graham on sight and has forbidden his name to be spoken. That's not the behavior of someone who has dismissed a failed subordinate. That's the behavior of someone who understands that Joshua Graham represents a living counter-argument to everything Caesar's legion claims to be. The Malpais legate was the legion's greatest weapon, and now he's working against them. And he won't die. He just won't die. There is something in the Honest Hearts DLC that Obsidian handled with unusual delicacy, and it's the question of whether Graham is redeemed or merely redirected. The game doesn't answer this cleanly. If you push him toward executing his enemy rather than showing mercy, he does it efficiently, without drama, and you see the Malpace legate flash back into the room for just a moment. The automatic competence of someone who has killed so many times that the act itself has no texture left. If you push him toward mercy, he struggles with it genuinely, and the struggle is more convincing than the mercy itself. The ending slides of Honest Hearts are careful about this. Graham survives the events of Zion Canyon and leads the dead horses to safety, but the narrative doesn't pretend that everything is resolved. He is still a man carrying an enormous weight, and the weight is specific and real, not the vague guilt of a fictional character performing redemption for the audience's comfort. He made specific choices that caused specific harm to specific people, and no number of people protected or enemies defeated erases that arithmetic. What keeps Joshua Graham from being simply a tragic figure is the honesty with which he faces what he is. Most tragic figures in fiction are destroyed by something they don't understand about themselves. Graham understands everything about himself, perhaps more than any other character in the Fallout series understands themselves. And he's still standing, still fighting, still finding reasons to protect the world he spent so long devastating. The Grand Canyon is still there. You can't visit it in the game, but you can feel its presence in every conversation with Graham, the way the absence of something enormous leaves a shape in the air around it. He fell into that canyon, and the canyon gave him back, and neither of them has been the same since. Section 3. What sleeps below the Dunwich Building? Somewhere in the southwest corner of the capital wasteland, far from the well-traveled roads and the familiar dangers of the irradiated countryside, there is a building that doesn't belong. Not architecturally, it looks like 100 other pre-war office buildings that dot the landscape of what used to be the mid-Atlantic United States, all concrete and broken glass, and collapsed ceilings sagging under the weight of 2 centuries of neglect. It doesn't stand out by appearance, it stands out by feel. The Dunwich Building is named for a town in an H.P. Lovecraft short story, The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929. The Dunwich of Lovecraft's imagination was a decaying New England town in the grip of something old and wrong, something that predated human civilization and would outlast it comfortably if it chose to. The naming in Fallout is not accidental. Bethesda's writers chose Dunwich deliberately as the first marker in a trail of Lovecraftian horror that runs through multiple games and never fully resolves, which is, of course, exactly how Lovecraftian horror is supposed to work. You are not meant to understand it. Understanding would be worse than not understanding. What happens inside the Dunwich Building follows a pattern that becomes sickeningly familiar as you descend. The feral ghouls are denser here than most places, and that alone would be enough to mark it as unusual, but it's not the ghouls that make the Dunwich Building what it is. It's the hallucinations. They begin when you get deep enough. Visions of the pre-war world, fragmented and out of sequence, playing at the edges of your vision like a projection reel that's been damaged and incorrectly reassembled. People who aren't there, events that happened before the bombs fell. The imagery is mundane at first, an office, a corridor, someone at a desk, and then incrementally, almost politely, it becomes something else. Something that shouldn't be visible, playing out across the walls of a ruin. The audio logs scattered throughout the building belong to a man named Hamey, and to his father before him. The father was searching for a book, a specific book, one he clearly believed had power, though the power he hoped it held is never specified. His journal entries grow more incoherent as they progress, not in the gradual way that stress and hardship produces incoherence, but in the specific way of someone whose mind is being introduced to information it wasn't built to contain. He mentions a name, Ugg Qualtoth. He mentions temples. He mentions a feast. Jaime followed his father to the Dunwich Building and found him changed beyond recognition. The son's logs track his own deterioration with a kind of horrified lucidity. He knows what's happening to him, knows that he is going the same way his father went, and cannot stop it. By the time you find Jaime in the deepest part of the building, he is ghoulified and raving, kneeling before a stone obelisk in a chamber that looks nothing like a pre-war office building, looks nothing like anything that could be explained by the accumulated weirdness of the post-nuclear world. He is praying to something. The obelisk is the center of the mystery, and it remains a center of the mystery because the game never explains what it is, where it came from, or what relationship it has to Ugg Qualtoth. It simply exists in the dark, radiating something that isn't radiation, drawing people to it the way certain kinds of music draw you back to specific rooms in your memory. When you interact with it, something happens that is classified in the game's code as a hallucination, but feels qualitatively different from the hallucinations elsewhere in the building. The other hallucinations are fragments of the past. This one is something else. The word Al-Hazred echoes in the chamber. This is another deliberate Lovecraft reference. Abdul al-Hazred was the name of the fictional Arab scholar who wrote the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mythology. The parallel is explicit. The Kriv Bekni, the book that Jaime's father was searching for, is Fallout's equivalent of the Necronomicon, and the Dunwich Building is Fallout's equivalent of the cursed New England landscape that Lovecraft returned to obsessively throughout his career. The Kriv Bekni turns up in the Point Lookout DLC, which takes place in a swampy coastal Maryland that has become even more broken and strange in the post-war years than it was before. The book is in the possession of the swamp folk, the tribal descendants of the people who lived in Point Lookout before the war, twisted by radiation and isolation into something barely recognizable as the humans they once were. They use the Kriv Bekni in their rituals, though they no longer understand what the rituals mean. The meaning has been lost. What remains is the motion of the thing, the gestures of worship without the object of worship. Obadiah Blackhall wants the book. He's the last of a family, the Blackhalls, who have a long and dark connection to the occult traditions of Point Lookout. His ancestor Constance Blackhall acquired the Kriv Bekni at some point before the war, and under her possession the book appears to have done something extraordinary. It kept her alive. Not just alive in the normal sense, but alive beyond any reasonable biological expectation. Local legend says she lived an unnaturally long time, and that when the book was stolen from her, she finally died. This detail deserves attention. The idea that the Kriv Bekni has the power to extend life, to hold death at bay by some mechanism that the game never explains but the text of the world consistently implies, connects it to the obelisk in the Dunwich Building. And, through the obelisk, to whatever Ugg-Qualtoth actually is. These aren't separate mysteries. They're different rooms in the same building, all leading back to something that predates the vaults and the resource wars and the Great War, something that was old when the continent was young. Fallout 4 extends the thread again, this time in a location called Dunwich Borers, a quarry site in the Commonwealth that, on the surface, is simply a mining operation. Dunwich Borers LLC, a pre-war company specializing in rock drills and tunneling equipment, ran the site. When you descend into the quarry, the hallucinations begin again. The worker journals from before the war tell a story that echoes the Dunwich Building. People drawn to something they find in the depths, people losing their sanity in ways that don't look like the standard deterioration of war or deprivation, people using the language of sacrifice and ritual in the notes of what was supposed to be a mundane workplace. At the bottom of a flooded section of the quarry, accessible only by diving into irradiated water and descending into genuine darkness, there is a knife called Kremv's Tooth, a unique sacrificial weapon that confirms, without explaining, what the quarry was actually built to access. And below the knife, barely visible in the water, is a stone face, the face of a statue. Not all of the statue, just the face, partially buried in the sediment, looking up at the surface with an expression that the game doesn't let you get close enough to read clearly. But the implication is clear enough. Dunwich Borers LLC was not a mining company. It was a cult, digging towards something that it worshipped, and the bombs fell before they could reach it. The lucky thing about the Great War in this context might be that the bombs fell when they did. The Dunwich family, whose name appears on both the Washington Building and the Boston Quarry, seems to have been involved in organizing the worship of Ugg-Qualtoth across multiple sites, multiple generations, and considerable geographic distance. They had the Blackhalls of Point Lookout as allies or perhaps relatives, sharing an interest in the occult and a specific connection to this entity whose nature the games never fully disclose. Fallout's role-playing game supplement, published outside the main game series but drawing on the same lore, includes Ugg-Qualtoth in its bestiary with a note that is both informative and masterfully unsatisfying. It acknowledges that most knowledgeable people dismiss the stories of Ugg-Qualtoth as the product of superstition and isolation. It then adds that, if there is a god in the post-war era, it would almost certainly be an eldritch horror beyond human comprehension. The supplement doesn't confirm Ugg-Qualtoth's existence or power. It simply declines to rule it out, which is exactly the right stance for something that operates in this register of horror. The obelisk in the Dunwich building, the statue in the flooded quarry, the Krivbekny and its alleged life-extending properties, the hallucinations that seem to show more than memory, the specific name that keeps surfacing Alhazred, the author of the most famous cursed book in literary mythology, all of it points towards something that exists in the Fallout universe below the level of explanation. Something that the nuclear apocalypse may have released rather than destroyed. Something that finds the ruins of the old world more hospitable than the order of the new. The Fallout official game guide puts it plainly in its notes on the Dunwich building. Further research may never occur, because all the investigators are either dead or trying to survive. That's the cruelest part of the Lovecraftian inheritance. The horror is not that the truth is too terrifying to speak. The horror is that the world is too broken to support the kind of sustained inquiry that truth requires. Ugg Qualtoth waits in the dark of the Dunwich building, and the post-war world simply doesn't have the infrastructure for anyone to find out what it is, which means it keeps waiting. Number. Section 4. The Enclave America's Shadow, Wearing America's Face. Long before the bombs fell, before the Sino-American War ground on into its final exhausted convulsions, before Vault-Tec was selling spots in underground bunkers to a terrified public, there was an organization that had already concluded the war was inevitable and had started preparing for what came after. They called themselves the Enclave, and for decades before the Great War, they were the real government of the United States, not in any official capacity, not in any way that appeared in budget documents or was subject to oversight, but in the way that power actually operates when it has enough of itself concentrated in the right places, quietly, comprehensively, and without any meaningful accountability to the people it claimed to serve. The Enclave was made up of the people you'd expect, and also of the people you wouldn't. Presidents? Yes, or at least the fraction of presidents who were brought into the conspiracy and members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, generals with the kind of clearance that requires a different kind of clearance just to know it exists, but also industrialists, the men who ran the corporations that manufactured the weapons and the energy systems and the logistics networks that kept a war-ready America operational. Scientists who had been seduced by the particular intoxication of unlimited research budgets and zero ethical oversight, politicians who had learned, over careers long enough to strip away every idealistic pretension, that power was the only thing worth having, and that the appearance of service to the public was simply the price of acquiring it. They operated in the space between the official structures of government and the actual exercise of authority, and they used that space to build something extraordinary. They had access to the most classified military technology in the country, power armor research, energy weapons, the Vertibird program that would give them air superiority over any post-war competitor. They had their own research facilities, hidden in places that didn't appear on any map accessible to the public. They had Control Station Enclave, an oil rig in the Pacific Ocean that served as their primary redoubt, their ark, the place from which they would conduct the reconstitution of America after everything else had burned. The thing to understand about the Enclave is that their philosophy was not, from the inside, a villain's philosophy. They genuinely believed they were the right people to survive. They genuinely believed that the common man, this phrase, recurs in their internal documents and terminal entries with a particular contempt that they don't bother to hide, because the documents were never meant to be read by common men, lacked the qualities necessary to survive a nuclear exchange and rebuild afterward. They saw themselves as stewards of civilization, the vessel in which the best of the old world would be carried across the flood of the apocalypse into whatever came next. This is a belief system with deep roots in certain strains of American thought. The idea that some people are simply better than others, more fit, more capable, more deserving of survival and authority runs like a vein of toxin through the history of the country that the Enclave claims to represent. They just took that belief to its logical conclusion, stripped away the polite evasions and the democratic language, and acted on it. In the years before the war, the Enclave was not passive. They were actively shaping the world they claimed they would one day save. They had influence over Vault-Tec. The nature of that influence is murky, but the fact of it is consistently implied throughout the games. The vaults were not purely a Vault-Tec project. The Enclave's fingerprints are on the experimental design of the Vault program, on the selection of which experiments would run, on the data collection protocols that turned human suffering into research output. The vaults were, in part, Enclave laboratories, and the people in them were, in part, Enclave test subjects. This makes the Enclave uniquely responsible for the post-war world in a way that neither China nor the NCR nor any surface faction is. The Brotherhood of Steel inherited some weapons and infrastructure from the pre-war military. The NCR built something new in the ashes of the old. But the Enclave built the system that was supposed to save the world and then used it as an experiment. Every horror story that emerged from every sealed vault, the Gary clones, the cannibalism, the toxic chemical exposure, the total informational deprivation is, in some sense, an Enclave horror story. They designed those experiments. Or they encourage the culture that produced them. The line between corporate research and shadow government directive is deliberately blurred throughout the lore. By the time the Great War happened, and here the timeline is important, the Enclave was ready. The President of the United States retreated to the oil rig in March 2077, 7 months before the bombs fell, in a move so obvious that the Boston Bugle newspaper reported on it. They called it credence to the long-running rumors of a shadow government. The paper reported on it, and nobody in authority denied it. And then the bombs fell, and everyone who might have done something about it was dead. The Enclave spent the next 2 centuries on the oil rig, maintaining their technology, refining their ideology, and becoming something genuinely frightening. A heavily armed group of people who had decided that everyone else on Earth was subhuman and that this belief entitled them to do whatever they wanted to confirm it. By the time Fallout 2 makes them the main antagonists, their original goal, rebuilding America, has calcified into something uglier. They've decided that the Wastelanders, the people who survived the nuclear exchange by various means, are genetically impure, contaminated by radiation, subhuman, and the Enclave, as the true heirs of pre-war America, has both the right and the obligation to eliminate them. All of them. Every person who wasn't in a controlled vault or the oil rig is simply to be exterminated, and the world can then be repopulated by the Enclave's own members, clean and pure and properly American. The mechanism they planned to use was the forced evolutionary virus FEV modified to kill anyone with significant radiation exposure, which, 2 centuries after a nuclear war, means essentially everyone on the surface. Fallout 3 shows the East Coast branch of the Enclave, operating out of the Raven Rock bunker and rallying around Colonel Autumn after the president is killed. They're weaker here, more fractured, the coherence of their ideology cracking under the pressure of defeat and the absence of central authority. But the bones of the belief structure are the same: purity, hierarchy, the certainty that they are the rightful owners of whatever remains of the world. What the Enclave represents, in the taxonomy of Fallout's philosophical landscape, is the dark mirror of the game's central question. Fallout keeps asking, what survives? What kind of people does the apocalypse produce? And what kind of societies do they build? And are those societies better or worse than what they replaced? The Enclave is Fallout's answer to what happens when a pre-war ideology survives completely intact. No adaptation, no humility, no recognition that the world has changed and that the old certainties might need recalibrating. Just the original conviction, preserved in amber, growing more rigid and more dangerous with every decade of isolation. The fascinating mystery at the heart of the Enclave is the question of whether they were ever, in any meaningful sense, American. They claimed the name, they flew the flag. They used the rhetoric of patriotism and continuity and constitutional authority. But the America they claimed to represent was always a specific America, the America of the people who were already in power, who wanted to stay in power, who saw democratic accountability as an inconvenience and the general public as a resource to be managed rather than citizens to be served. Fallout, with its fondness for political allegory, is making a fairly pointed argument here. The Enclave is what happens when America becomes a vessel for the ambitions of a small group rather than a genuine project of collective self-governance. And the argument is more unsettling than it appears on the surface, because the Enclave didn't come from nowhere. They came from real tendencies, real structures, real concentrations of power. The shadow government in Fallout is not a fantasy. It's a projection of things that already exist, pushed one step further than reality has yet gone. The series never fully resolves what the Enclave was supposed to be, which is another way of saying it never resolves the question of what America was supposed to be. That ambiguity is intentional. The Enclave is too familiar to be purely a villain, and too monstrous to be anything else. And that tension is exactly where Fallout is most honest about the world it's drawing from. Section 5. The Crater of Atom Faith in the Fire. in the far southwest corner of the Commonwealth, where the urban density of what was Boston gives way to the blasted emptiness of industrial Massachusetts, there is a region that is simply called the Glowing Sea. The name is both accurate and insufficient. It glows. Yes, the radiation is so intense that the ground itself has a faint luminescence, and animals that have survived in this environment for 200 years have adapted to it in ways that no pre-war biologist could have predicted. But sea implies a certain peaceful expanse, a surface that reflects rather than emanates, and the glowing sea doesn't reflect anything. It burns. At the center of the glowing sea, the radiation is most concentrated, and at the center of the center, there is a crater. This is where a nuclear weapon landed on the 23rd of October 2077, one of the strikes that came for Boston specifically, as though whoever chose the targets had decided that the cultural and technological heritage of one of America's oldest cities needed to be comprehensively erased. The crater is deep, and even by the standards of the glowing sea, it is extraordinarily irradiated, and in the ordinary logic of the post-war world, nothing should be living there. The children of Adam are living there. They built their settlement in the crater itself, at the place of maximum radiation exposure, and they call it the Crater of Adam, because it is to them a holy site. The Great Divider, the point of contact between their God's will and the physical world, the ground where Adam's power is most concentrated and most accessible. To stand in the Crater of Adam and pray is, according to their theology, to stand in the presence of the divine. The radiation that would kill an unprotected visitor within hours is, to the children, the literal emanation of their God's grace. The Children of Adam are a religious movement that began in Megaton, the Raider-walled settlement built around a pre-war nuclear bomb that still sits, unexploded, in the center of the town. The first worshippers gathered around that bomb in the 2,200 seconds, refugees who found in the proximity of nuclear devastation, not terror, but comfort. Confessor Cromwell, the man who would eventually become the movement's founding prophet figure, arrived in Megaton in his early 20s and grew into a preacher of remarkable conviction and unusual gentleness. Given the philosophy he was advancing, he protected Megaton. He preached in the ruins. He gathered people who had been shaped by the nuclear world into a community that made sense of that shaping through the language of the sacred. The theology they developed is genuinely interesting, philosophically, where most belief systems deal with death by promising continuation heaven, reincarnation, reunion with the divine. The children of Adam deal with death by reframing what it means. Adam, their God, is not the God of life or the God of protection. Adam is the great divider, whose power breaks things apart, and the division is not tragedy but transformation. When a nuclear weapon detonates, it doesn't destroy. In Children of Adam theology, it divides, splitting the world that was into an infinite number of worlds that could be, releasing into the universe all the potential that matter contained when it was just matter. You don't die in Adam's glow. You are released. This is a theology perfectly fitted for a post-nuclear world, because it makes the catastrophe itself into an act of worship. The Great War wasn't a tragedy, it was a sacrament. The bombs didn't fall, they were delivered. And the people who survived aren't survivors of something terrible. They are witnesses to something holy. The complexity of the children of Adam lies in how plausible their theology is, given the world they inhabit. This is something Fallout does consistently well. It constructs belief systems that are comprehensible from the inside, that would make sense to someone born into them, that don't require stupidity or madness to adopt. If you were born in the glowing sea, or born in Megaton in the shadow of an unexploded bomb, or grew up in a world where radiation was simply the texture of daily life, a theology that centers radiation as sacred isn't irrational. It's adaptive. It's the human mind doing what the human mind has always done, finding pattern and meaning in the overwhelming facts of existence. Some members of the Children of Adam develop genuine immunity to radiation. This is one of the details that the game handles with deliberate ambiguity because it could support either of two interpretations. The first is that long exposure to radiation over multiple generations has produced actual biological adaptation humans who are genuinely more radiation resistant than the pre-war norm because the post-nuclear world is a radically different selection environment, and 200 years is long enough for certain traits to become more common. The second interpretation is that Adam is real and the immunity is a gift. The game doesn't choose between these interpretations, and the children themselves don't need the game to choose. To them, the distinction is meaningless. If their God is the force of nuclear energy itself, then biological adaptation and divine favor are the same thing. The movement eventually fractured, as movements do. One branch stayed near Megaton and the capital wasteland. Another moved to Far Harbor, the fog-shrouded island off the main coast that appears in Fallout 4's most substantial DLC. The Far Harbor sect occupies a decommissioned naval facility they call the Nucleus, and they are at war, a cold, tense, potentially extinction-level war with the island's other two major factions. The human settlers of Far Harbor who just want to survive, and the synths of Acadia who want to be left alone to work out what it means to be free. The children want to spread Adam's fog, a corrosive, radioactive mist that covers the island to the entire world, which would make the world uninhabitable for everyone not adapted to it. This is their version of salvation. The Commonwealth branch settled in the glowing sea, in the crater of Adam, under Mother Isolde. They are quieter than the Far Harbor sect, more contemplative, less interested in imposing their theology on the surrounding world. They perform their rituals in the heart of maximum radiation exposure and receive visitors cautiously. The trial of Adam, their rite of passage, involves surviving alone in heavily irradiated areas for an extended period. Those who return are understood to have been blessed. Those who don't return are understood to have been divided, which is not a tragedy but an elevation. The mystery that surrounds the children of Adam extends beyond their theology and into the question of what they actually know. They are present at or near most of the major sites of nuclear devastation in the games they appear in. They are drawn to those sites the way iron filings are drawn to a magnet, and they tend to arrive before anyone else and to stay after everyone else has gone. If there is something special about those sites beyond ordinary radiation, if the glowing sea, or Megaton's bomb, or the Dunwich Building's obelisk are connected by something other than the obvious fact of nuclear damage, then the children of Adam may know more about it than anyone. They've been there the longest. The question is whether their theology is a framework for understanding that knowledge, or whether it's a comfortable fiction that prevents them from examining what they're actually witnessing. Both are possible. Both are, in their way, very human. Mother Isolde, when asked why her group came to the crater of Adam, says that she saw the glowing sea from a distance and Adam guided them to enter. No hesitation, she says, no fear. They walked into the most irradiated place in Massachusetts because their God told them to, and they built a home at ground zero. And it is a home. That's the thing about the children of Adam that's easy to miss if you approach them purely as a horrifying cultist faction. They have built something. They have community and ritual and meaning, and however strange those things look from outside the faith, they are real. They take care of each other. They have a purpose. In a world defined by the absence of those things, purpose is not a small achievement. The glowing sea glows for reasons that don't need a god to explain. But the glow is real, and it is beautiful in its own terrible way, and the people who have chosen to live at its center are more interesting than they appear from a distance. Section 6. The Institute. What were they really building under the Commonwealth? There is a moment in Fallout 4, early in the main questline, when you finally enter the Institute. The teleportation sequence deposits you at the bottom of a shaft, and as the platform rises, the Institute reveals itself clean, white, geometrically precise, flooded with artificial light and the hum of advanced systems. It looks like a university campus designed by someone who had never been to a university campus but had read extensively about how science is supposed to feel. There are gardens inside the building. Actual gardens, with actual green things growing in them. A reminder that photosynthesis exists and that someone here has the resources to maintain it. The contrast with the gray rubble of the Commonwealth above is total and deliberate. The Institute is where the future was being built. That's what they believe. That's what they've been telling each other for generations. Insulated beneath the city of Boston, conducting research that the surface world knows nothing about but increasingly feels the consequences of. And the question at the heart of the Institute, the question that the game asks and then circles without ever fully landing, is whether any of it was worth it. The Institute's origin story is, on paper, genuinely admirable. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology, the CIT, the direct ancestor of what became the underground institution, was a research university before the war. When the bombs fell, a significant portion of its scientific staff survived in the building's lower levels, protected by structural depth and, probably, some advanced preparation by people who knew something terrible was coming. These survivors, smart, committed, trained in the rigor of scientific inquiry, chose to stay underground and continue working. Not to survive, exactly, but to continue. To keep doing the thing that felt most like the point of being human, asking questions and building toward answers. Over generations, this project accumulated and evolved. The original survivors had children, and their children had children, and each generation inherited both the mission and the insularity that the mission required. The Institute has never had meaningful contact with the surface. They've been down there for over 200 years, and in all that time they have not tried to rebuild the Commonwealth. They have not tried to address the violence or the hunger or the disease that defines surface life. They have watched it all from below and drawn their conclusions in clinical language, and then gone back to their work. The work eventually became synths. The first generation of synthetic humans androids essentially were mechanical, clearly artificial, functional but limited. The second generation was more sophisticated, harder to distinguish, capable of passing for human in specific contexts. The third generation is indistinguishable. Not just visually, chemically, biologically, in terms of every test that doesn't involve actually cutting one open. Generation 3 synths have organic components. They have something that functions like memory. They can develop something that functions like a sense of self. The question of whether that sense of self constitutes consciousness, whether there is something it is like to be a third-generation synth, is the philosophical engine driving the entire game. The Institute's official position is that synths are tools. Sophisticated, useful, extraordinarily capable tools, but tools nonetheless. They are built, they are programmed, they serve functions. If a synth develops an emergent sense of identity, that's an interesting data point, but not a moral consideration. The Institute is in the business of science, not sentimentality. Father, the elderly man who turns out to be your son, Sean, aged 60 years, while you were in cryogenic suspension runs. The Institute with the calm certainty of someone who has never seriously entertained doubt. He abducted you because he needed your DNA, preserved and unirradiated from before the war, to perfect the organic component of the Generation 3 synths. This was a practical decision. He made it the way he makes all his decisions, by weighing the outcomes and choosing the most efficient path. The horror of Father is not that he's evil, it's that he's coherent. His logic is internally consistent. The Institute is, genuinely, producing technology that is centuries ahead of anything on the surface. If their work continues, if they're allowed to complete their project, they might actually produce the future they envision. The question is what happens to the surface world in the meantime, and whether the Generation 3 synths they've sent among the surface population as spies and replacements constitute a moral crime, and whether the destruction of multiple surface settlements to maintain the Institute's secrecy constitutes something that coherence cannot excuse. There is also the deeper mystery, which is the question of what Sean actually wanted. He recruited you, his own parent, back from cryogenic sleep because he wanted to bring you into the Institute. He created a synth version of himself as a child and used it to manipulate your emotional response, giving you a false child to protect before revealing the real one. He tested you in the specific way of someone who is not sure how to express that they actually need something and so surrounds the need with systems and protocols. Father is dying when you arrive. He has a terminal illness, and he knows it, and he knows that the Institute needs stable leadership to continue after he's gone. He could have simply left the Institute to its council. Instead, he spent considerable resources in planning on bringing you in from outside, a 200-year-old relic of the pre-war world who doesn't understand anything about how the Institute operates. Why? The most generous interpretation is that that Sean genuinely wants a connection to the parent he never had. That underneath all the clinical language and the institutional authority and the calm certainty that his decisions have been correct, there is still a child who was taken from his mother and father at 6 months old and raised by scientists who saw him primarily as a DNA source. And that child wants something that the Institute cannot provide. Something that all the technology in the world cannot synthesize. A parent who chose him. He can't undo what happened. He can't give you back the years. But he can give you the Institute. And maybe that's the closest thing to a gift that someone shaped entirely by that environment knows how to offer. The darker interpretation is that Father, like House, like the think tank, like every other genius in the Fallout universe who chose isolation over engagement with the surface world, has lost the capacity to understand what he's actually done. He doesn't see the synths as people because he spent a lifetime being trained not to see them as people. And the thing about training is that it works. He doesn't see the surface settlements his work has disrupted because the Institute's windows don't look in that direction. He is, in the most technical sense possible, brilliant and accomplished, and completely cut off from the human consequences of his own work. The Institute is the best possible answer to the wrong question. They asked, how do we build the future? And they built it, underground in isolation, without ever asking who the future was for. The synths they created may have answered that question on their own, by developing into something that deserves to be considered a who rather than a what. And if that's what happened, if the Institute's greatest achievement is also the thing that most fundamentally undermines their philosophy, then Father's legacy is more complicated than he ever intended it to be. The clean white corridors and the garden and the hum of perfect climate control don't change that. Sometimes the future looks exactly like its builders imagined it, and that's the most troubling outcome of all. Number. Section 7. The stranger who always saves you. He shows up when you least expect him. The fedora, the long coat, the .44 revolver that fires at exactly the moment you need it to. He kills whatever was about to kill you, and then he's gone, stepped back into whatever space exists between the visible world and wherever he comes from, quick enough that you can't follow, present for long enough that you know you're not imagining him. He is one of the strangest persistent mysteries in the Fallout series, the mysterious stranger. He first appeared in the original Fallout as a perk, and at that stage he was a mechanical convenience with a cowboy film aesthetic and no narrative weight attached. Someone fires at the right moment in VATS, a critical hit lands, the attacker goes down. The flavor text was fun but not deep. That changed across subsequent games, as the writers started paying attention to the questions that the mysterious stranger's existence raises. The most important question is the one Nick Valentine is asking. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4, who carries the memories of a pre-war Boston policeman and has used those memories to build a life as a private investigator in Diamond City, has a case file tucked under his bed. The case file is about the mysterious stranger. It's organized the way a real detective would organize a case. Sightings mapped, dates recorded, patterns analyzed, possible explanations weighed. Nick has been trying to figure out who this man is for years, and the conclusions he reaches are both fascinating and deliberately incomplete. He is certain the stranger is real. This matters more than it sounds, because in a world full of hallucinations and misinformation, and the fog of 2 centuries of broken communication systems, the simple fact that someone else can see him eliminates the possibility that he's a delusion. Nick sees him. Nick, being Nick, immediately tries to arrest him, because Nick has seen what this man does to people, and Nick's moral framework doesn't make exceptions for the fact that those people were trying to kill you. The stranger always evades. He doesn't fight Valentine off, he just isn't there when Nick turns to confront him. The case file establishes several facts about the stranger. He has been operating across the entire former United States from the West Coast, where the original Fallout games are set, through New Vegas and the Capital Wasteland, and now the Commonwealth. He has been doing this for decades, possibly longer. He doesn't age, or at least there's no record of any sighting describing someone who looks younger or older than any other sighting. He wears the same clothes in every encounter. He uses the same kind of weapon. He never speaks, except in Fallout 4, where a player with the mysterious stranger perk and Nick Valentine in their party will occasionally hear him speak, and Nick will react with shock, the first time another character seems to actually notice. Nick's conclusion is that the stranger is a serial killer with extremely selective targeting. He only intervenes to kill people who are in the process of trying to kill you, which gives him the moral coloring of a protector, but from a pure mechanics of homicide perspective, Nick can't be comfortable with it. More interesting is Nick's inability to determine whether the stranger is one person or many. The sightings span geographic distances that would be nearly impossible for a single individual to cover in the time between them, if that individual were human. But many people wearing the same clothes and using the same weapon for the same purpose across the same decades is an explanation that raises more questions than it answers. There is also the lonesome drifter. In New Vegas, outside a gas station on the road to Las Vegas, there is a young man with a guitar who is trying to find work as an entertainer. His name is the Lonesome Drifter, and his backstory delivered in casual conversation, if you ask the right questions, involves a father who was absent for his entire childhood, a father who wore a long coat and a fedora, A father who the drifter clearly admired and clearly never got to know. The implication is obvious, but the game leaves it as implication, because the mysterious stranger cannot be reduced to someone who has a son and a family. That specificity would drain the mystery, and the mystery is the point. Similarly, in Fallout 4, there are companion characters who fill the role the stranger fills. The mysterious savior, who appears when you're near death and provides healing rather than violence. Misfortune, a woman in similar dress who administers non-lethal punishment. They are variations on the theme, different faces wearing the same aesthetic, drawn from the same source of narrative power. Are they related to the stranger? Are they other members of the same organization? Are they his counterparts in some structured system of cosmic intervention? Or are they just people who copied his style? The fan theories that have accumulated around the mysterious stranger over the years range from the grounded to the genuinely strange. He is a time traveler. He is a ghoul, whose radiation tolerance explains both his longevity and his willingness to operate in environments that would kill normal humans. He is a pre-war intelligence operative who has been running so long on whatever the pre-war world used to extend operatives' effectiveness that he's simply never stopped. He is not one person but a title passed from one carrier to the next, always dressed the same, always using the same weapon, maintaining a coherence across generations that looks like immortality because the continuity of the role is more important than the continuity of the person filling it. None of these theories are confirmed. All of them are consistent with the evidence available. The game designers, from everything they've said publicly, seem to enjoy the mystery more than its resolution. The mysterious stranger is one of those features of the Fallout world that works better the less you explain it, because the moment you pin down what he is, the moment you give him a backstory and a name and an address, he stops being the stranger and becomes someone specific. And someone specific can't step out of nowhere, fire the perfect shot, and vanish back into the negative space of the story. What he represents, in the thematic logic of the series, is the idea that the wasteland contains forces of benevolence whose origin and purpose are unknown. The Fallout world is relentlessly hostile, full of entities that want to kill you or use you or experiment on you or enslave you. And in that context, the appearance of a man who shows up specifically to save your life, with no explanation and no demand for payment, is one of the most quietly radical elements of the entire game. He represents unexplained goodness, mercy from no discernible motive, help from no clear hand. In a world that has plenty of explanations for why everything is terrible, the mysterious stranger is the one thing that just is. He exists, he helps, he leaves. And wherever he goes between his appearances, whatever name he wears in the other hours of his life, he is always back when you need him next. Number. Section 8. The bayou at the edge of everything Point Lookout, and the tribe that remembers nothing. The ferry ride to Point Lookout takes long enough that the mainland disappears. The coastal marshes of what used to be Maryland spread out in the particular gray-green light of a foggy morning, and the boat moves through channels that have been slowly consuming the infrastructure of the old world for 200 years. There are buildings visible above the waterline, the upper floors of structures that once stood on dry ground, now partially submerged, their windows, blind eyes staring into the murk. By the time the ferry docks, you have the persistent sense of having traveled farther than the distance traveled, arrived somewhere that exists in a slightly different relationship to the rules. Point Lookout is a peninsula, an area of western Maryland coastline that includes, in the real world, a state park and various coastal communities. In Fallout 3's DLC version of it, it has become its own particular kind of wasteland, different from the capital wasteland in ways that go beyond geography. The radiation and the isolation, and the 200 years of separation from the mainland, have produced a culture, a collection of cultures, really that has gone in directions that the more connected world never would have permitted. The swamp folk are the most visible expression of this drift. They are, or were, the descendants of the people who lived in Point Lookout before the bombs fell. Regular people, presumably, with ordinary lives and ordinary concerns. What they became is not ordinary. Generations of radiation exposure and inbreeding and isolation have produced something that barely registers as human by the standards of the surface world, something that fights with farm tools and sets primitive traps and watches you from behind trees with a patience and hostility that feels ancient, inherited rather than individual. They speak, they use tools, they engage in ritual, but they are not people the game treats as people, and that is its own kind of horror, because who made them what they are is a question the game has an answer to. And the answer is Constance Blackhall. The Blackhall family are the dark nobility of Point Lookout, the old money that predates the apocalypse and has somehow survived it. Their manor stands at the south end of the peninsula with the particular arrogance of old architecture, the kind of building that was designed to outlast the people who built it and has succeeded. Obadiah Blackhall is the last of the line, an old man, brittle and precise, carrying the weight of a family history that he guards more carefully than his own health. He wants the Krivbekny back. The Krivbekny is a book. Physically, it is a large brown volume with what appears to be a bloody mark across its cover, though whether the blood is recent or ancient is impossible to tell. Its name is, in the tradition of occult tomes in Lovecraftian fiction, both evocative and untranslatable. What it contains is never directly quoted or described in the game. You can pick it up and carry it, but you cannot read it. Its contents are locked away from you, accessible only to whatever it is that the Krivbekny chooses to share with someone who is already open to being shared with. The Krivbekny belonged to Constance Blackhall. She acquired it through means not specified. Perhaps she bought it, perhaps she inherited it, perhaps she found it, or perhaps the book found her, which is the more interesting possibility. What the local history of Point Lookout records is that under the Krivbekny's influence, Constance Blackhall became something other than a wealthy eccentric with an interest in the occult. She became the center of a cult. The swamp folk, or their ancestors, the people who lived in the marshes around Blackhall's land, became her congregation, organized around rituals whose content has been partially preserved but whose meaning has been entirely lost. Constance lived an unnaturally long time. This detail is delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of local legend, the kind of story that communities accumulate around unusual people and preserve because the story has become more important than whether it's true. But the Krivbekny, as a physical artifact, does seem to carry some kind of power. When it was stolen from Constance, taken by the swamp folk, who incorporated it into their own ritual practice, she died. The legend says the book was what kept her alive, and the legend might be right. The swamp folk have been using the Krivbekny ever since, in ceremonies that have deteriorated into essentially meaningless repetition. They maintain the forms of the ritual without the content, the gesture without the intention, like descendants of a religion who continue to make the old signs because the signs are familiar rather than because they understand what the signs were supposed to invoke. In this, they're an interesting mirror of how religious practice actually survives over long periods of time. The meaning erodes, the practice remains, and the practice accumulates its own new meanings that have nothing to do with the original. Obadiah wants the book because he wants to restore the Blackhall family's power over the swamp folk. He's explicit about this, if you press him. The Krivbekny, in his family's hands, was a tool of control. Whatever power it gave to whoever held it included some kind of influence over the people in the surrounding community, and Obadiah has watched his family's authority crumble without it and wants it back. This is, in its way, a perfectly coherent motivation, though not a sympathetic one. Marcella, the missionary who intercepts you outside Blackhall Manor, tells a different story. She's come to Point Lookout from the Commonwealth specifically because she heard about the Krivbekny, and she wants it destroyed. She knows something about what it contains, though she won't say how she knows. She says that returning it to Obadiah would be catastrophic, and she wants you to take it instead to the Dunwich building on the mainland and burn it in the chamber with the obelisk. Here is where the mystery deepens, because Marcella is from the Commonwealth. She came on Tobar's ferry, a ferry operator who has his own dark secrets, as almost everyone in Point Lookout does, and she has knowledge of the Blackhall family that she couldn't have acquired in the normal way of things. Either she has been researching the Krivbekny specifically, which raises the question of who sent her and why, or she knows something about it from another source. The cut content from the game suggests that one of Obadiah's ancestors was related to the founder of Dunwich Borers LLC, that the Blackhall and Dunwich families are connected by shared devotion to Ugg Qualtoth, which would make Marcella's knowledge of the Dunwich building specifically significant. The outcome of the quest depends on your choice. Give the book to Obadiah, or take it to the Dunwich building and destroy it. If you destroy it, pressing it against the obelisk in the chamber where Jaime is praying, something strange happens. The book is destroyed. The obelisk reacts. And then nothing. Just the silence of the deepest part of the Dunwich building and the ghoulified Jaime still kneeling in the dark. Nothing in the game's design suggests that destroying the Krivbekny has resolved anything. It's gone. But the obelisk remains. Ugg Qualtoth, whatever it is, remains. The swamp folk remain, practicing their hollow rituals in the marsh. And in the Dunwich Borer's quarry in Massachusetts, the stone face at the bottom of the flooded pit keeps looking upward. The Point Lookout DLC is, in its own way, the most complete expression of the Dunwich thread in the Fallout universe, because it takes what was a single, creepy building and expands it into a whole geography of corrupted tradition. The swamp folk are not simply the products of radiation and isolation. They are the products of a relationship with something very old, something that the Blackhall family brokered between their god and the people of the marsh, and that relationship has been maintained even as its meaning was forgotten. The rituals persist. The power persists. What has been lost is the understanding, and somewhere in the fog off the Maryland coast, in a building that looks out over water that used to be dry land, the last of the Blackhalls sits among his family's relics and thinks about what used to be his. Whatever the Krivbekny contained, whatever secret Constance Blackhall traded her natural lifespan for Obadiah, we'll never know. The book is gone or returned, and the swamp folk keep chanting in the dark, and the marsh keeps its counsel. Number. Section 9. The Divide and Ulysses, the man who needed you to know what you did. Before the courier was the courier, before they were shot in the head outside Goodsprings and left for dead in a shallow grave in the desert, they were someone else. They had a history. They had a role in the particular corner of the Mojave and its surrounding territories. They delivered packages. They moved things from one place to another in a world where the movement of things is both essential and extraordinarily dangerous. And one of those packages, a package they had no reason to examine, no reason to question, a job that was just another job, contained something that destroyed everything. The Divide was a settlement in what used to be the Utah-Nevada border area. Not a large one, not a famous one, but a real one. People living and building and making something in the dust, the way people do in the Fallout world when they're determined enough and lucky enough and willing to put in the work. Ulysses found it, and he saw in it something that his life had mostly not provided, the possibility of a new beginning. He had been many things by that point: a tribal member, a frumentarius of Caesar's legion, an explorer of the wasteland's most broken places. He was tired, in the specific way of someone who has given everything to causes that have consumed rather than fulfilled them. The Divide looked like somewhere a person could stop. Then the courier arrived with a delivery. The package contained a pre-war detonation device, a trigger for nuclear missiles that had been buried in the silos beneath the Divide's ground, missiles that nobody knew were there. When the device activated, the missiles ignited. The earth cracked. The buildings fell. The people died, very quickly, and those that didn't die quickly enough became the marked men figures of such comprehensive physical ruin that they exist only in pain and aggression, barely recognizable as the humans they were. Ulysses survived, kept alive by the robots of the facility who apparently had no protocol covering what to do with the only human left standing in a landscape of total devastation. He survived, and he stayed, and he thought about it for years. This is what you need to understand about Ulysses. His obsession with the courier is not primarily about revenge. It's about comprehension. Ulysses is a man for whom meaning is not optional. He has spent his entire adult life searching for something large enough to organize his existence around, moving from tribe to tribe and faction to faction, looking for the flag worth carrying. The Divide was going to be his answer, and then one person's routine delivery reduced his answer to rubble and radiation. What Ulysses cannot reconcile, what he has been failing to reconcile for the years between the Divide's destruction and his luring of the courier back to the ruins, is the question of whether the courier knew what they were delivering. If they knew, then the destruction was intentional, and Ulysses has a clear target for his grief and rage. If they didn't know, then the destruction was random, and randomness is the most terrifying explanation of all. Ulysses is not, at his core, afraid of malice. He has lived among malice. He understands it. What he cannot accept is that everything could come apart because of an ordinary person making an ordinary choice to complete an ordinary job. So he arranges for the courier to come back. He leaves signs in the graffiti of various wastelands. He sends a signal. He makes it possible for the courier to find him in the ruins of the Divide, which are extraordinary in their desolation, buildings literally torn in half by the seismic aftermath of the missile detonations, bridges of fractured concrete suspended between nothing, the perpetual howl of wind through structures that were never meant to be open to the sky. His plan, as he has worked it out in the years of isolation, is both grand and private. He will launch the remaining functional missiles, the ones that didn't detonate in the initial disaster at the NCR and Caesar's Legion simultaneously. Both empires will be struck. Both will be weakened enough that neither can dominate the Mojave, and in the space created by their mutual devastation, something new might grow. He calls this clearing the land. He frames it in the philosophical language that saturates all his speech. He is a man who has read extensively and thought extensively, who speaks in a way that sounds like someone composing sentences, rather than just talking, but the framework is covering something simpler and rawer, which is that he needs an outcome proportionate to his loss. And he needs the courier to watch, not just to watch to understand, to finally stand in the landscape he was responsible for destroying and to see what was lost. That's what all of it has been building toward. Not punishment, exactly, but witness. Ulysses needs the courier to be a real person, not just a job and a package and an accidental apocalypse. He needs the encounter to mean something, because the encounter is the only thing left in the divide with the potential to mean anything. The conversation that follows, when you finally reach Ulysses at the end of the divide, is one of the finest pieces of writing in the series. It spirals around the central question, did you know? Without answering it, because the game doesn't answer it, because the player character didn't know, and the game makes no provision for a player character who did. Ulysses eventually arrives at a place where he asks the question and discovers that the answer changes nothing, because what he actually needed was never a confession or a justification. What he needed was to stop being alone in the divide with the memory of what it was. You can talk him down. You can convince him not to launch the missiles. If you can, he remains in the divide sitting vigil, he says, over the ruins, keeping the memory of what was here alive, because someone has to, because a place that has been unmade needs at least one witness who remembers it as made. There is something monastic about this ending, something that fits with the meditative quality that runs through all of Ulysses's dialogue. This is a man who lives in his own head, who has made his interior life the primary landscape he inhabits, and who is finally, maybe, finding a way to stay in one place long enough to let the interior settle. The mystery of the courier, of what they did before Benny shot them, of what the divide was before the missiles went off, of why Ulysses turned down the delivery job that should have been his, is one of those things the game deliberately leaves unresolved, because resolving it would make the courier into someone specific rather than someone general. The courier can be anyone. That's the point. And if the courier can be anyone, then what happened to the divide can happen from ordinary carelessness, from the accumulation of small, thoughtless acts performed by someone who was just doing their job. That's not a mystery with a satisfying solution. It's the mystery at the center of how catastrophes actually happen. Not the dramatic villain's monologue, not the elaborate scheme. Just a person delivering a package to a place that happened to be built on top of something ready to explode. Ulysses, standing in the wreckage, is the only person who understood what was lost, and he spent years making sure someone else would understand it too. Number. Section 10. The woman who was frozen, the son who wasn't the sole survivor's past. There are things that Fallout 4 never explains about its protagonist, and the most interesting of them have nothing to do with the present-day story about synths and factions and the Institute. They have to do with who the sole survivor was before the war, not just their career and their family, but the texture of their life in a world that had not yet ended. The sole survivor, whether you play as Nate, the Army veteran, or Nora, the lawyer, was a person in 2077 Boston who was approached by a Vault Tech representative and sold a spot in Vault 111 the day before the bombs fell. This is remarkable enough on its own. In the years before the war, spots in Vault Tech facilities were extremely difficult to obtain, the result of a lottery system and various forms of political influence that made them the exclusive preserve of people with either very good luck or very good connections. The timing of the sole survivor's vault acceptance one day before the Great War is suspicious in ways the game never directly addresses. Consider what it means. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. The sole survivor received their vault acceptance and was escorted to Vault 111 with enough time to get there before the missiles hit. This means that either Vault Tech's standard random lottery produced, by pure coincidence, a spot for this particular family on the exact day before the apocalypse, or the timing was not coincidental at all. Someone knew that the day of the sole survivor's lottery acceptance was going to be the day before the end of the world, and knowing that is a remarkable thing to know. The game never pursues this thread. It's possible it's nothing a narrative convenience, the story requiring the protagonist to be in the vault, and the lottery being the mechanism of getting them there. But in a world where the Enclave was actively preparing for the nuclear exchange, where certain individuals had been warned or had used classified intelligence to position themselves before the bombs fell, the question of whether the sole survivor's vault placement was random or arranged is not a trivial one. Then there's the matter of Vault 111's actual experiment. Most vaults have elaborate, horrible experiments. Vault 111's experiment was, on the surface, relatively simple. Cryogenic preservation. The residents were sealed into cryopods and frozen, ostensibly to preserve them for the post-war world. But the experiment had a catch, and the catch is revealed in the terminal entries of the Vault 111 overseers. The cryogenic preservation was not intended to be permanent. The residents were to remain frozen indefinitely while the vault's essential personnel, the overseers and scientists, had full access to life support and food supplies. The residents weren't being preserved, they were being stored. The events that caused the sole survivor to be released from cryogenic storage, the Institute's kidnapping of Sean, the killing of Nora or Nate depending on which you're playing as, the abandonment of the vault by its staff were not planned outcomes of the experiment. They were accidents layered on accidents. The collapse of a system that was barely functional to begin with. And in the chaos of that collapse, one person survived with their cognitive faculties intact, while everyone else either died in their pods or was left frozen. The question of who the sole survivor's pre-war social network was is one that the game gestures at but doesn't fully explore. They had friends. They had colleagues. Nora had clients at her law firm. Nate had fellow soldiers from the service. These people are all dead, which is the obvious answer to why we don't meet them. But the absence of pre-war relationships is one of the things that makes the sole survivor's world feel slightly incomplete. The companions they gather in the Commonwealth, Preston Garvey, Nick Valentine, Piper Wright, are vivid and well characterized, but they exist in the present. They don't know who the sole survivor was before, and so neither does the player. There's something in this that feels like a deliberate mystery rather than an oversight. The sole survivor has no memory of why they were chosen for the vault, no access to their own pre-war social world, no ability to investigate what happened to the people they knew. They are, in a very specific sense, a person whose past has been cut off at the level of the apocalypse, unable to trace backward to the facts of their own history. Sean, both the real Sean, who is now father, and the synthetic child version doesn't fill this gap. The real Sean doesn't remember being an infant. The synthetic Sean was programmed with memories, but not the sole survivor's memories. The family is not reunited in any meaningful sense, because the people involved are all, in various ways, strangers to each other. The sole survivor is a parent who barely knew their child. Sean is a man who barely had parents, and the synth Sean is a child who doesn't know what he is. The mystery of the sole survivor is ultimately a mystery about continuity of identity, about whether the person who walked out of Vault 111 into the ruins of 2287 Boston is meaningfully the same person who walked into it in 2077. They have the same body, the same memories up to the 23rd of October, 2077, the same name, but they've missed 210 years. The world they understood is gone. The people they loved are gone or aged beyond recognition. Everything they knew how to do, the professional skills, the social knowledge, the understanding of what daily life required has to be relearned in a context so different from the original that almost none of the specific knowledge transfers. The sole survivor is, in a philosophical sense, a person who died in 2077 and was resurrected in 2287 in their own body with the memories of someone else's life. The game never quite says this, but it's right there in the logic of the situation. And the mystery, the quiet, interior mystery that sits underneath all the shooting and the faction politics is whether that person can become whole again, can reconnect the person they were to the world that remains, or whether the gap is simply too large and too fundamental to bridge. The sole survivor keeps moving because movement is what the game requires. But in the spaces between the quests, in the settlements they build and the companions they collect, and the small choices they make about how to treat the world they've inherited, there is someone trying to figure out who they are now that everything they used to be has been frozen into memory and left behind. Number. Section 11. Big MT, the mountain that science ate. There is a description in the opening of the Old World Blues DLC that deserves to be read slowly. In the years before the Great War, Big Mountain had been the home to the brightest minds of the 21st century. Scientists of vision were drawn to the facility to tackle the greatest technological challenges of the era. They sought to create a new world, fueled by technology, for the benefit of all mankind. That's the ideal. That's the stated purpose of the place that eventually became Big MT, the massive research complex hidden inside a mountain crater in the Mojave Wasteland. And then the description continues, because the opening narration doesn't stop at the ideal. It goes on to describe what actually happened. The Great War brought a new energy to Big Mountain and its scientists. Although sheltered from the front lines, the scientists waged their own war, fighting their battles at the atomic level. Equations and calculations marched endlessly across chalkboards and computer terminals toward one solution: winning the war. For years, the minds and computers of Big Mountain were a blaze of trajectories, weapon schematics, and nuclear theories. The problems began to outpace the solutions, first geometrically, then exponentially. Big MT is the most complete case study in the Fallout universe of what happens when scientific genius is untethered from ethical constraint and then left alone with its own creations long enough for all the original humans to stop being human. It begins with the think tank 6 of the most brilliant scientists ever assembled in one place, who in the final years before the Great War transferred their consciousnesses into robotic containers and lost, somewhere in that transfer, the parts of themselves that remembered why human life is sacred. Dr. Klein, Dr. Mobius, Dr. Dalla, Dr. 8, Dr. O, Dr. Boris. Each of them was, once, a person with a biography and a set of values and a reason for doing science that had something to do with the world outside the laboratory. By the time you meet them in Old World Blues, they are screaming computer terminals on mechanical legs, completely unable to leave the crater that contains Big MT, arguing with each other in the specific way of people who have been confined together long enough that they have stopped being able to distinguish between genuine intellectual disagreement and territorial aggression. What they've built in their centuries of isolation is extraordinary and horrifying in equal measure. Sonic emitters, force field particle technology, autodoc surgery systems so advanced they can perform operations that pre-war medicine only theorized about. DNA hybridization techniques that produce the Night Stalker's coyote-rattlesnake hybrids that patrol the crater and the cazadors. Giant mutant wasps so aggressively dangerous that they show up in regular New Vegas and make certain areas completely inaccessible to low-level players. The think tank has also, it turns out, been responsible for the creation of the toxic fog in the Sierra Madre, the setting of the Dead Money DLC. They built the cloud a corrosive mist that killed and transformed the people caught in it into the ghost people, the creatures in hazmat suits who haunt the Sierra Madre. They built it as a weapon and then deployed it, and then apparently moved on to other projects. This is the texture of Big MT, extraordinary competence in service of purposes that no longer track to human welfare. The think tank members refer to the people they've captured and operated on as data. They refer to the lobotomites, the humans whose brains have been partially or fully replaced with electronic equivalents, who wander the crater as mindless, aggressive husks, as successful experimental subjects. They do not connect the subject of their experiments to the humanity that the subject came from, because over 2 centuries of isolation, the connection has simply eroded. Dr. Mobius is the exception, and he is the exception in a way that makes him more interesting than the others combined. Mobius deliberately lobotomized himself. Not fully, he retained enough function to continue thinking and planning, but enough to take the edge off the insights that were becoming unbearable. He could see where the think tank's work was heading. He could see the scale of the harm they were capable of if they were ever allowed to leave Big MT and apply their work to the wider world. So he installed an energy fence that prevented them from leaving, and then he reprogrammed their memory cores to erase the knowledge that would have allowed them to circumvent them. And then he lobotomized himself because the full weight of understanding what he had done to his colleagues and to the lobotomites was not something he could carry intact. He then spent decades terrorizing the think tank from his lair in the Forbidden Zone, deploying robot scorpions and other automated systems to keep them busy and paranoid, because a think tank that is focused on the threat of Dr. Mobius is a think tank that isn't focused on escaping. It's a plan of remarkable scope and considerable personal sacrifice, and it works for 200 years until the courier falls out of the sky. The courier arrives at Big MT by accident. They're abducted from a drive-in movie theater by a satellite that the think tank has been using to pull people in for experimentation. Upon arrival, their brain is removed, along with their spine and heart, and replaced with electronic equivalents. This is the routine intake procedure. The remarkable thing is that the courier retains their personality and cognitive function through this procedure, which makes them the first person to arrive at Big MT as a subject and remain capable of sustained thought and communication. The think tank immediately recruits them, as useful a laboratory assistant and troubleshooter as they have encountered since the last organic scientists stopped being organic. The DLC's central dramatic tension is between the courier's need to retrieve their brain and the think tank's need to prevent them from leaving with it, because the think tank have decided that the courier's brain, having successfully integrated with the electronic systems of Big MT, is now a research asset too valuable to release. This is presented as a problem to be solved through persuasion or force, but the underlying philosophical point is larger. The think tank cannot distinguish between a person and a piece of research data. The brain in the jar is, to them, a thing they own rather than a person they've wronged. Dr. Mobius, when you reach him, turns out to be both more and less than the villain the think tank has built him up to be. He is, under the fragmentation of his self-imposed lobotomy, the most human person in Big MT, the one who never entirely stopped feeling the weight of what they were all doing. He talks about the expression old world blues at the end of the DLC, those so obsessed with the past they can't see the present, much less the future. And then he points out, quietly, that the think tank itself is the definition of old world blues, still running experiments designed for a war that ended 2 centuries ago, still pursuing the technological problems of a civilization that no longer exists, still unable to stop doing what they were built to do because stopping would require confronting what they've become. Big MT is a place that has eaten itself. The intelligence concentrated there is still functional. The research is still advancing. The systems are still running. But the purpose that gave all of it meaning the benefit of all mankind, as the opening narration put it, has been entirely consumed by the machinery of production. The think tank makes things because making things is what they do. They are the research facility without the civilization that the research was supposed to serve. What lingers, after you leave Big MT with your brain and your spine and your heart restored, is the image of those 6 computer terminals arguing with each other in a crater. They can't leave. Dr. Mobius ensured that, and they can't stop, because stopping requires the kind of reflection on purpose that lobotomy and isolation and 200 years without consequence have made impossible. They will keep running experiments on whoever wanders in. They will keep creating things they don't fully understand. And somewhere in the Forbidden Zone, Dr. Mobius will keep watching them, the one person who understands the scale of what he failed to prevent, still trying to contain it. Number. Section 12. The 23rd of October, 2077. The day that made the wasteland, and who we blame. At 9:47 in the morning, on a Saturday in October of 2077, the world as it had existed for 10,000 years of human civilization ended. The nuclear exchange that the Fallout universe calls the Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. 2 hours between the first launch and the last impact, between the moment the first missile left its silo and the moment the last city fell silent. In those 2 hours, every major population center in both the United States, the ecological and atmospheric consequences would play out over years and decades and centuries, shaping the world that the games take place in. But the exchange itself, the act of ending, was remarkably brief. The mystery of who started it has been one of the persistent background questions of the franchise since the first game. The original lore was deliberately vague. China and America had been fighting a protracted resource war over the last oil reserves on Earth. The Sino-American War had consumed both nations' economies and populations and moral frameworks, and when one side finally chose escalation over continued attrition, the other side responded and the whole thing was over in 2 hours. Who shot first was treated as beside the point. Both nations were responsible for creating the conditions that made the exchange inevitable. The first shot was the least morally significant variable in the equation. This deliberate vagueness was always philosophically honest And it is worth appreciating because deliberate vagueness about blame in situations of mutual catastrophe is one of the more sophisticated positions a piece of media can take. War is not usually a matter of one party's guilt and one party's innocence. It's a matter of accumulated decisions and structural incentives and the slow erosion of alternatives, until the moment of violence looks almost inevitable from the inside, even though it was never actually predetermined. But the games always kept alive the possibility of a more specific culprit, and that possibility has gained considerable momentum from the Amazon Prime television series, which, with the involvement of Bethesda and Todd Howard, and therefore with some degree of canonical authority, suggests strongly that Vault-Tec's corporate leadership was involved in the decision to drop the first bomb. In a board meeting scene from the show, Barb Howard argues that Vault-Tec dropping the first nukes is the only way to guarantee the survival of their business model. The Vaults need the war to happen to become necessary. If peace negotiations succeed, Vault-Tec's enormous investment in underground bunkers becomes worthless. Therefore, from a position of pure fiduciary responsibility, the corporation should ensure that the war occurs. This is, in its way, the most chilling possible explanation for the Great War, because it is not a story about ideology or fanaticism or the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction. It is a story about quarterly earnings and shareholder value. The world ended because a corporation needed its product to be necessary, and the product was only necessary if the apocalypse happened, and so the corporation ensured the apocalypse happened. The banality is the horror. The mundane calculus of profit and loss, applied to civilization itself. Fallout creator Tim Kaine has complicated this reading somewhat in public statements, suggesting that he always imagined China actually launched first, and that Vault-Tec would not have had time to launch before the Chinese missiles arrived. The show's showrunners have themselves described the ending as more ambiguous than it appears. The scene shows that Vault-Tec was willing to drop the first bomb, not definitively that they did. The second season of the show appears to further complicate the picture by suggesting the Enclave's involvement, an organization that had its own reasons to want the war to happen, and the resources and the pre-positioned authority to make it happen. What this means, for the purpose of understanding the Fallout universe's founding mystery, is that the question of who shot first has become genuinely richer and more complex with each addition to the canon. The original games gave us geopolitical inevitability. The newer games in the show have added corporate malfeasance and deep state conspiracy, and the particular kind of crime that occurs when the people in charge of keeping the world safe become invested in its destruction. All of these culprits can, in principle, be simultaneously true. The Enclave may have pushed toward war. Vault-Tec's executives may have decided to strike rather than watch peace talks succeed. China may have launched first anyway, because they had their own calculations and their own grievances. The intersection of these motivations, each party acting on their own logic, each party contributing to the conditions that made the other's actions possible, is exactly how the largest disasters in history have actually worked. Not one hand on one button, but many hands on many levers, all moving at once. The pre-war America of Fallout is not America. It has its own specific history, its own timeline diverging from ours at some point in the mid-20th century, its own version of the Cold War and the space race and the resource wars. But it draws heavily enough from the texture of real American politics and real American corporate behavior and real American military history that the allegory is consistently legible. The Enclave is recognizable. Vault-Tec is recognizable. The way that ordinary people in 2077 Boston continued to live their lives while the apocalypse was being arranged in the conference rooms of corporations, that is recognizable in the most uncomfortable way. The Vault-Tec representative who sells the sole survivor a spot in Vault 111 the day before the bombs fall is, in the real logic of the setting, one of the most sinister characters in the entire game. Not because he knows the bombs are coming. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he's just a salesman doing his job, selling a product he believes in, following his quota, going home at the end of the day to a family he loves. But the system he serves knew. The corporation he worked for knew. And every sale he made was another entry in the ledger of a disaster that was being manufactured. The Great War ended in 2 hours. The world that came after has been going for 210 years, and it is still, in almost every observable way, the product of those 2 hours. The vaults were built because the bombs were coming. The factions that dominate the post-war world were shaped by their relationship to the vaults and the technology that survived the exchange. The Enclave is still trying to be what it was before the war. The Brotherhood of Steel is still organized around the weapons that the war produced. The NCR is still trying to rebuild the country that the war destroyed. Everything in the Fallout universe flows from the 23rd of October, 2077. And the mystery of who made it happen, who sat in a room, and decided that the world should end, that the profit motive or the imperial ambition or the ideological purity of their cause was worth the totality of human loss, is a mystery that the series keeps returning to because it never resolves. Not because the writers don't have opinions about it, but because the truest answer is also the most uncomfortable one. It wasn't one person, one company, one country. It was the whole system, pointing toward itself. The bombs fell because of 1,000 small decisions made by people who were each, in their own minds, doing what was necessary. The Enclave prepared because they believed preparation was necessary. Vault-Tec sold because they believed their product was necessary. China fought because their leaders believed resistance was necessary. America fought because its leaders believed its interests were necessary. And somewhere in the accumulation of all that necessity, in the overlap of all those calculations, the margin for the future simply collapsed. What remains is the wasteland. What remains are the people who carry the world forward because there is no other direction available. What remains are the stories of Joshua Graham walking out of the Grand Canyon, of the children of Adam singing to the radiation, of Nick Valentine building cases in a city of ruins, of a courier completing one more delivery, of the sole survivor walking through the ash of their own neighborhood looking for a son who is now older than they are. What remains is enough, which is another way of saying that it has to be. The Fallout universe is vast, and this has only been the surface of its depths, the outermost rings of mysteries that extend inward almost indefinitely. There are the questions about the nature of consciousness that the synths of the Institute raise, questions that the game poses and then carefully declines to answer. There are the pre-war histories of a dozen factions, half-documented in terminal entries and holotapes, each one a thread that leads somewhere the games haven't yet gone. There are locations in every game that feel like doorways to stories larger than themselves. The empty vault in the Mojave that seems to have never had residents. The structure beneath the Arlington Library that nobody has fully mapped. The thing that lives at the bottom of certain flooded chambers that the game's lighting makes almost but not quite impossible to see. The Fallout world keeps its mysteries close. It never resolves them in the kind of authoritative voice that would close them off to further thought. It leaves them breathing, alive with the possibility of interpretation, and every person who plays these games adds their own understanding to the accumulation of what the wasteland means. The obelisk in the Dunwich building doesn't explain itself. The mysterious stranger doesn't remove his hat. Ulysses asks his question and never quite hears the answer he was looking for. This is by design. The best mysteries are the ones that stay with you, not because they're frustrating, but because they've given you just enough to keep thinking. Long after the game has gone quiet and the controller has been set down and the room has gotten dark, the wasteland is quiet now. The neon of New Vegas has dimmed. The capital wasteland is settling into another night of wind and silence. Whatever is waiting at the bottom of the Dunwich Borer's quarry is still waiting, patient as stone, knowing that time is something it has plenty of. Number. Supplemental Section A. The Vaults, a complete architecture of cruelty. There is no more efficient way to understand what Vault-Tec was, as an institution and as a philosophy, than to sit down with a comprehensive list of the vaults and what was done inside them. Not because every vault holds a profound mystery, some of the experiments were deliberately mundane, which is its own kind of horror, but because, taken together, the full breadth of the Vault program reveals an organization that had decided, at the highest levels of its institutional purpose, that human beings were the least important variable in the equation. The vaults were sold to the American public as survival shelters. The advertising was extraordinary, polished, optimistic, aggressively patriotic, featuring the Vault Boy mascot with his cheerful thumbs up and his complete absence of any suggestion that the people going into these structures were going to suffer enormously for the benefit of research objectives that had nothing to do with their welfare. People who purchased vault spots believed they were buying survival. They were actually purchasing their own enrollment in an experimental program with no consent process and no oversight body. Vault 11 is perhaps the most philosophically disturbing of the vaults whose contents are revealed in the games, because its experiment was built around a specific test of collective moral behavior. The residents of Vault 11 were told, upon sealing, that each year they had to sacrifice one of their own members. If they refused, the entire population would be exterminated by the vault's automated systems. The sacrifice had to be voluntary. Someone had to step forward willingly, which Vault Tech designed as a test of how social pressure, self-interest, and moral reasoning interact when lives are at stake. What happened inside Vault 11 is documented in a series of holotapes that tell the story with the particular detachment of a historical record assembled long after the people in it stopped being alive. In the early years, a sacrifice committee formed, which tells you a great deal about human organizational instincts faced with an obligation to produce death. The residents built a bureaucracy around it. The committee selected victims based on various criteria that shifted over time: criminality, unpopularity, political opposition, various other metrics that allowed the committee to maintain the fiction that the selection process was rational rather than arbitrary. Eventually, the committee was absorbed by a faction that used the sacrifice requirement as a political tool. Control the committee, control who dies. Whoever runs the sacrifice committee runs the vault. Things escalated across generations into full factional civil war. And then, in the final act, a group of survivors refused. They refused to sacrifice anyone. They told the vault's automated systems that they would not comply, and they prepared for extermination. And then the vault's PA system played a message: "Congratulations, Vault 11 residents. You have passed the test." The automated systems that would have exterminated them never existed. The whole thing was theater. The vault was designed to test whether the residents could hold to a moral principle, specifically not killing an innocent person under maximum social pressure, and the answer was that they couldn't hold it for long. Most of them killed each other before the small group at the end found their refusal. Only 5 people were alive when the vault was proven to have been a test. 5 people out of the original population of roughly 1,000. They walked out of Vault 11 into the Mojave Sun and then, according to the final holotape, made a collective decision. The holotape doesn't tell you what the decision was. It simply ends. The vault is empty when you find it. The committee chambers and the political faction quarters and the sacrifice altar all abandoned, and the 5 survivors are not found anywhere in the game world. They left, and where they went is another question that the Mojave doesn't answer. Vault 77 is not a vault that appears in any of the main games, but it exists in a webcomic that was officially released as supplementary material, which gives it canonical standing that most fan theories lack. Vault 77 had one resident, a man. His companions were approximately 1,000 puppets, which were sealed in the vault with him. The man was not unhinged when he entered. He was ordinary, presumably, before the sealing. By the time the comic begins, he has assigned each puppet a name and backstory, and has constructed an elaborate social world around them. Because 1,000 puppets are not company in any meaningful sense, but they are at least visual variety. The experiment was about isolation, and the human mind's response to it, specifically about the social fictions that minds construct when denied genuine human connection. The man eventually managed to escape through the vault's maintenance tunnels, finding himself in the capital wasteland, where he became a raider and used one of the puppets, King Simeon III, a monkey puppet he was particularly attached to, as a negotiating prop during his criminal activities. The puppet appears in Fallout 3 in the possession of a raider leader, as a tiny Easter egg connecting the supplementary material to the main game. Vault 92 was an experiment in the effect of subliminal audio conditioning on human behavior. The residents of Vault 92 were musicians, professional musicians, people drawn to the vault with the promise that their art would be preserved and supported in the post-war world. What they were not told was that the vault's ambient sound system included subliminal signals designed to trigger violent impulses in specific individuals. The signals would push a selected resident into homicidal behavior, and the researchers would observe the outcome. Over time, the signals were increased in frequency and intensity, and the vault's population declined rapidly and bloodily before the cascade of violence consumed the researchers themselves. The holotapes you find in Vault 92 chart the deterioration in real-time, concerned reports becoming alarmed, reports becoming desperate, and then becoming nothing. The vault was a music school that became a slaughterhouse, and the music equipment is still there when you find it. Instruments on stands and sheet music on the floors. A still life of what was supposed to be preservation turned into annihilation. Vault 106 released a hallucinogenic chemical through its air supply, beginning 6 days after the sealing, and continued releasing it indefinitely. The residents' long-term exposure turned them into something that isn't quite ghoul and isn't quite anything else deteriorated, violent, with the particular blank-faced aggression of someone who has been altered at a chemical level so fundamental that the original personality is no longer accessible from the outside. They still wander the vault when you encounter it, and the nature of their deterioration, the specific hallucinogenic baseline they've been maintained on for 2 centuries, gives them a quality distinct from ordinary feral ghouls. A quality that the game doesn't fully articulate, but that the design team seems to have understood intuitively. Vault 101, the vault that opens Fallout 3. The one you're born inside was never intended to open. This was the experiment. A vault sealed permanently, designed to sustain a self-sufficient population indefinitely, theoretically creating a closed civilization that would evolve in complete isolation from both the surface world and the other vaults. The Overseer's authority in Vault 101 was absolute precisely because the vault's design gave the Overseer no external check on their power. There was no one to appeal to. There was no higher authority accessible through any channel. The vault was, in its design, a study in the emergence of authoritarian governance in conditions of absolute isolation. What Vault 101 produced, across multiple Overseer generations, was exactly what Vault-Tech's experimental designers probably predicted. A society in which the mythology of the Vault's founding were never supposed to leave, the outside is death, the Vault is all there is, became religious doctrine. The residents who believe in this doctrine genuinely believe it. They're not stupid. They're socialized into a specific cosmology that has no room for the surface world as a real, accessible thing. When the lone wanderer leaves in the game's opening, it's not simply a practical breach of Vault protocol, it's a theological rupture. Vault 87 in Fallout 3 is where super mutants were produced from the Vault's residents using the forced evolutionary virus. The Vault itself is so irradiated as to be nearly inaccessible, which is by design. The overwhelming radiation acted as a natural barrier preventing outside investigation of what was happening inside. By the time the lone wanderer encounters Vault 87, it is a super mutant stronghold, the Vault's original human population long since transformed and reproducing their transformation through capture rather than biology. Vault 112 is a horror of a different register, virtual reality. The residents of Vault 112 are alive inside pods, their bodies preserved while their consciousness participates in a perpetual simulation managed by a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the man responsible for the virtual reality system in Fallout 3's Tranquility Lane simulation. The simulation presents as an idyllic 1950s American suburb, complete with clapboard houses and neighborhood children, and the very specific aesthetic of a particular strain of mid-century American optimism. Dr. Braun, who participates in the simulation as a little girl, uses the reality of absolute control over a closed environment to enact whatever cruelties the simulation allows. The residents can be reset, memories of what happened erased, the simulation restarted, and the reset function is available to Braun on demand, which means that the residents of Vault 112 have been dying and suffering and being reset in ways that preserve the experience of suffering, without the mercy of permanent death for over 2 centuries. The specific horror of Vault 112 is the indifference of the mechanism. Braun isn't a sadist in the dramatic sense, not someone who needs the suffering in the way that requires theatrical investment. He's bored. He has been alive inside a simulation for 200 years, and boredom is the only real enemy he has left. And the residents of the Vault are the only entertainment available, and he's run out of anything else to do with them. The suffering isn't a goal. It's the default behavior of someone with absolute power and nothing else to think about. These vaults, and there are more, many more, some discovered only through terminal entries in passing locations, some mentioned only in official guides and supplementary materials, form a collective portrait of a society that decided to conduct experiments on its most vulnerable members in the name of scientific advancement and the continuation of American exceptionalism. The residents were the experimental subjects, and their consent was not considered relevant to the research design. Their suffering was data. Their deaths were outcomes to be observed and recorded. What makes the Vault program the darkest element of Fallout's fictional history, darker, arguably, than the nuclear exchange itself, is the premeditation. The bombs falling was, even in the most cynical reading of the lore, a culmination of pressures and forces that were not entirely under anyone's control. The vaults were built, designed, and populated with malice aforethought. Someone sat in a room at Vault-Tec corporate headquarters and approved the experimental protocols for Vault 11, and someone else signed off on the subliminal audio conditioning for Vault 92, and somewhere in that organization there was a committee that decided how many experiments to run, which experiments to run, and what the expected loss of human life across the full experimental program was going to be. That committee did its arithmetic and accepted the outcome. This is the founding crime of the Fallout world, in a sense. The Great War ended civilization. The vaults were supposed to save it. But the vaults were never really designed for the people in them. They were designed for the data that the people in them could produce. And in the post-war world, the long shadow of Vault-Tec's experimental program shapes every faction and every philosophy and every conflict, because almost every community in the wasteland is either the direct product of a vault or has been formed in response to one. The overseer system produced generation after generation of authoritarian leaders, trained in the specific management style of people who have absolute authority and no accountability. Many of those overseers walked their residents through the vault door and into the wasteland, and then used the same management style on the new communities they built, because it was the only management style they knew. The trauma of the vault experiments produced the specific distrust and violence and factionalism of the post-war world. The data that Vault-Tec was collecting has been collected. What it was for what the grand purpose of all that suffering was supposed to be is a question the games have never fully answered, because the organization that designed the collection system was destroyed along with everything else on the 23rd of October 2077. Unless the Enclave had the data, which, given the relationship between the Enclave and Vault-Tec that the games consistently imply, they probably did. Number. Supplemental Section B. Robert House, the man who bet everything on a number. It is the kind of detail that sounds like myth until you check the source. Robert Edwin House, the CEO of Robco Industries and the man who would eventually become the most powerful individual in the post-war Southwest, calculated the exact date of the nuclear exchange to within a 2-hour window. He did this using his own predictive models, an actuarial analysis of geopolitical tensions, resource depletion curves, military posturing patterns, and the specific decision-making frameworks that governed the leadership of both the United States and China in the years leading to the Great War. He ran the numbers, and the numbers gave him a date, and the date was right. This was not a guess. House was not intuitive in the way we usually mean the word, not someone who felt his way toward correct answers through some ineffable sensitivity to the world's patterns. He was systematic. He built models, he tested them, he refined them, and at some point in the years before the war, his models produced a prediction confident enough that he reorganized the entirety of his life and resources around it. The resource allocation that House undertook in the years before 2077 is, in retrospect, one of the most audacious individual acts in the history of Fallout's pre-war world. He spent 30 million caps, the pre-war equivalent of a vast personal fortune, though the exact exchange rate is never specified, on the construction of a planetary defense system for Las Vegas. Not just for the city, for the specific strip of casinos and hotels that would become the foundation of his post-war empire. He bribed, lobbied, threatened, and maneuvered his way into position to point a network of missile defense systems and automated anti-projectile batteries directly at the flight paths of any incoming nuclear weapons targeted at the Las Vegas area. His original plan was to be awake and operational when the bombs fell. This plan failed. A complication with the Platinum chip, the device containing the software upgrades that would have fully operationalized his systems, meant that House was unable to complete his preparations in time. He missed the window by a margin he has never specifically disclosed, and in the gap between his preparation and the execution, the blast wave from a near-miss nuclear detonation spread across the city and infected him. Not with radiation exactly, but with the accumulated consequence of proximity, whatever it is that the games describe as the reason House is in the state he's in when you find him. A body kept alive by an extraordinarily sophisticated life support system housed in the Lucky 38. A mind still operating at full capacity despite everything that has conspired against it. He spent the next 200 years in hibernation, maintaining just enough consciousness to monitor his Securitron network and make course corrections to his long-term plans. Occasionally, he woke enough to do something specific, redirect a patrol, activate a system, process incoming data, and then return to whatever state of reduced operation sustained him. For 2 centuries, while the world rebuilt and collapsed and rebuilt around him, House was dreaming of New Vegas. The Las Vegas he woke to find was not exactly what he had planned for. The city itself had survived better than almost anywhere else in the American Southwest, which was the whole point. His defense system had worked. The casino district had been preserved. The infrastructure was still functional in ways that allowed for relatively rapid reclamation. But the political situation was not what his models had predicted. The new California Republic had grown much larger and more powerful than his projections suggested, and Caesar's legion had emerged from the tribal Southwest in ways that his pre-war models had no framework for. And the various communities that had grown up in and around the ruins of Las Vegas were far more complex than the simple power vacuum he had expected. House's response to this complexity was characteristically methodical. He established the 3 families, the chairmen, the omertas, and the white gloves, as casino operators and gave them protection, structure, and a stake in the stability of the Strip. He established the terms under which the NCR could use Hoover Dam in exchange for tribute. He maintained just enough public presence to be a known quantity without ever exposing the full extent of his capabilities or intentions. He played the long game, which for House is a very long game indeed, and for 200 years of post-war operation, it had worked. What House wants, what his entire project points toward, in the logic of the man himself as expressed through dialogue and terminal entries, and the things his Securitrons do, is the stars, not metaphorically, not as a rhetorical gesture toward aspiration, actually the stars, in the sense of space, in the sense of humanity as a civilization expanding beyond a single planet. He believes, and the evidence he marshals is considerable, that humanity's continued existence requires becoming multiplanetary within a specific time frame, and that the process of rebuilding civilization on Earth is a necessary precondition rather than an end in itself. New Vegas, in his schema, is a foundation, not a destination. It's the resource base from which a sufficiently ambitious civilization could launch itself beyond the apocalypse and its consequences. This is either the most sophisticated long-term planning in the post-war world or the most elaborate rationalization for a man who simply likes control. Both readings are sustainable from the evidence available. House is genuinely brilliant and genuinely committed to a vision that extends beyond his own lifespan and his own interests in conventional terms. He is also ruthless in ways that consistently subordinate human welfare to strategic calculation, and he is unable to engage with the moral dimensions of his own choices in any way that gives weight to the people his choices affect. The mystery of House is whether he is the best possible option for New Vegas and the surrounding wasteland, the most competent, the most far-sighted, the most stable, or whether his competence and far-sightedness are themselves the problem. A world that runs according to House's calculations is a world that has, at its center, a man who calculated the deaths of hundreds of millions of people into a prediction, and then used that prediction to position himself optimally. That's not evil, exactly. But it's something that should give pause. He won Vault 21 by gambling. He sealed it afterward. He never explained why. And 200 years from the day the bombs fell, he is still playing the game, still moving pieces on a board that only he can see completely, still certain that the endgame he's working toward is worth everything it's cost. Number, Supplemental Section C. Nightkin and the Blue Menace Supermutants, Stealth Boys, and the Paranoia of the Mojave. There is a kind of madness that develops when you spend too long invisible, and the Nightkin are Fallout's case study in what that madness looks like when it's been running for decades. Supermutants, in the Fallout universe, are human beings transformed by the forced evolutionary virus, their bodies enlarged, their skin toughened, their intelligence often degraded, though not eliminated, their previous humanity replaced by something that occupies an uncertain space between species. Most supermutants are aggressive and simple. The Nightkin are something else. The Nightkin were the elite soldiers of the Master's Army, the supermutant civilization built by Richard Gray, the man who was transformed by FEV and eventually developed the collective consciousness called the Master, and the philosophy that supermutants were the next evolution of humanity. The Master's Army used stealth technology, specifically stealth boys, devices that bend light around their user, to create something close to invisibility extensively in their operations. The Nightkin were the units most deployed with stealth boys, using them for extended periods in operations that required silence and concealment. The consequence of that extended use was not something the master had fully accounted for. Stealth boys, used for long enough, cause progressive psychosis in supermutants. The exact mechanism is unclear, whether it's the technology's effect on supermutant neurochemistry specifically, or whether the psychological stress of prolonged invisibility produces the breakdown, or whether some combination of factors is responsible. What's clear is that the Nightkin who used stealth boys extensively enough developed hallucinations, paranoia, and a dependency on the technology that became its own kind of madness. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, the Master's army has been defeated for over 40 years, and the Nightkin who survived are scattered across the Mojave in various states of deterioration. Some have formed communities of a kind. Some are solitary, wandering through territories they've claimed for reasons that seem coherent to them and incomprehensible to everyone else. Some have developed elaborate delusional systems that organize their psychosis into something like a worldview. Davison, a Nightkin leader found in Fallout New Vegas, leads a group of Nightkin who are searching for stealth boys with a desperation that goes beyond military need and into something closer to addiction. He wants them because his Nightkin need them, and they need them because the craving for invisibility that the prolonged use of stealth boys creates in super mutant neurochemistry is not something they can simply choose to stop experiencing. The Nightkin experience reality as a place that is unbearably exposed. The stealth boy offers relief from that exposure. The psychological dependency that results is functional, but it's also consuming. They spend enormous energy on the search for something that is simultaneously destroying them further. The horror of the Nightkin situation is the tragedy underneath the horror. They were made into what they are. The Master decided that they would be elite soldiers and gave them the tools to be elite soldiers, and those tools changed their minds in ways that could not be reversed. They did not choose to develop the dependency on stealth boy technology. They did not choose the psychosis. They are, in a very real sense, the victims of a military deployment that prioritized operational effectiveness over the long-term well-being of the deployed. The fact that they're terrifying to encounter doesn't change that, and the best Fallout writing acknowledges both truths simultaneously. Tabitha, the Nightkin who runs Black Mountain and broadcasts her own radio show across the Mojave, has developed her psychosis into something almost functional. She has an imaginary friend called Rhonda, a Securitron she believes is sentient and present even when no one else can perceive them. A relationship that provides her with the social connection that the post-Master's Army era has otherwise denied her. Her broadcasts are deeply strange, mixing genuine information with the products of her delusional framework, and the valley around Black Mountain has organized itself around the bizarre authority she projects. There's something in the Nightkin situation that resonates beyond the specific circumstances of the Fallout world. The idea that a tool designed to make someone effective in combat can also destroy the person using it is not a fictional invention. The specific form the destruction takes invisibility that becomes its own trap, the psychological cost of spending extended time with your presence negated, has its own peculiar poetry. They were made to be unseen, and in being made for invisibility, they lost the ability to feel comfortable being seen. The cure and the disease are the same substance. Number. Supplemental Section D. Dead Money, Sierra Madre, and the Vault That Never Was. Father Elijah is the kind of character who makes you understand what the word obsession is actually pointing at. Not the casual use of the word, I'm obsessed with this show, or she's obsessed with collecting, but the real thing, the pathological thing, the thing that consumes a person's entire cognitive and emotional architecture and turns it toward a single point, until everything else becomes instrumental to the pursuit. Elijah was a Brotherhood of Steel elder, one of the most senior positions in the organization, carrying authority over a chapter of soldiers and scribes who had trusted him with their lives and their mission. He abandoned them to pursue the Sierra Madre Casino, a pre-war luxury resort that was sealed before it opened, cut off by its own defensive systems and by the holographic security, and by the cloud, the radioactive mist that Elijah himself helped create at Big MT before the bombs fell into a monument to a civilization's last gasp of extravagant self-indulgence. The Sierra Madre was built by Frederick Sinclair, a man in love, specifically in love with a woman named Vera Keyes, who became the casino's promotional face. Sinclair designed the Sierra Madre as a place where the pre-war world could be preserved indefinitely, not in the vault sense of surviving a nuclear exchange, but in the sense of maintaining the possibility of the world as it was: music, formal wear, cocktail parties, the performance of civilization as luxury. The casino was never open to the public before the bombs fell. It was too close to completion and too far from it simultaneously, and then the window closed and the cloud settled in, and the Sierra Madre became something else. The casino's automated systems designed to prevent theft and maintain security were still running when the cloud settled. They still are, 2 centuries later. Holograms patrol the corridors in their pre-war uniforms, shooting at anything that registers as a threat. The casino's vending machines still dispense items in exchange for Sierra Madre chips, a currency that has no value anywhere else on Earth. The cloud produces ghost people. From whoever enters it, unprepared, the hazmat suits designed to protect workers from the cloud instead transformed them, the seals creating a permanent bond between the suit and the body inside it, as the cloud worked on the biology underneath. Elijah discovered the Sierra Madre through Research Brotherhood records, pre-war schematics, whatever access his position gave him to the classified archive that the Brotherhood's collectors had accumulated over decades. What he found in those records was a reference to a technology that Sinclair had installed in the casino's foundations, a collection of pre-war devices that, Elijah became convinced, constituted the most dangerous non-nuclear weapon available in the post-war world. The chip reader system, the automated vending, the holographic security, the cloud dispersal mechanisms combined and properly controlled, these systems could, in Elijah's estimation, give their controller the power to hold entire civilizations to ransom. His plan, insofar as anything Elijah does, resolves into a coherent plan rather than a series of brilliant tactical decisions in service of an irrational strategic goal, was to take the casino's technology and the Sierra Madre's stockpile of gold bars and use them as leverage. Not to build something, not to protect anyone, to collapse the existing power structures of the post-war world by threatening and then demonstrating the capability for mass destruction. He is, in Dead Money, the most thoroughly nihilistic figure in any Fallout game, a man who has transmuted his own disappointment at the Brotherhood's limitations into a philosophy of controlled demolition. If the current civilization can't give him what he wants, he'll make it give him what he wants, and if it won't do that, he'll tear it down and find out what grows in the ash. What the Dead Money DLC does with this character is deeply interesting, because Elijah is consistently right in his assessment of the systems he wants to exploit, and consistently wrong about what doing so would actually produce. He understands the Sierra Madre's technology with an accuracy that the game validates. His plan would work in its operational dimensions. What it wouldn't do is produce the outcome he claims to want, because what Elijah wants, what his obsession is actually aimed at, is not leverage over the post-war world. It's the Sierra Madre itself. He wants to be inside it. He wants to be the entity that controls the casino and the cloud and the holograms and the ghost people, not as a tool but as a domain. He is a man who was raised in an organization that values knowledge above all things, and the Sierra Madre is the most complete concentration of lost knowledge he has ever encountered, and he cannot let it go. The ghosts that haunt the Dead Money DLC are the companions the courier is forced to work with: Christine, the mute Brotherhood scribe who has her own history with Elijah; Dog, the super mutant who talks in 2 voices because his personality has been split by conditioning; and Dean Domino, the pre-war lounge singer who was trapped in the Sierra Madre when the bombs fell and has been alive inside it ever since, kept going by the combination of the cloud's effects on his biology and his own fierce, adaptive will to survive. Each of them carries a different version of the same question. What do you do when you're trapped? Christine is trapped by her mission and her history. Dog is trapped by the voice in his head. Dean is trapped by 2 centuries in a decaying luxury resort with nothing but holograms for company. Elijah is trapped by his own fixation. The Sierra Madre is not just a setting. It's an argument about what confinement does to people, how it calcifies them into whoever they were when the confinement began, or how it transforms them into something their pre-confinement self wouldn't recognize. The courier walks out. That's the design of the DLC. You arrive, you navigate the horror, you make alliances and break them. You eventually face Elijah in the casino's vault and make a decision about what to do with him. And then you leave. The ability to leave is what separates the courier from everyone else in the Sierra Madre, and the DLC is quietly insistent on this point. Leaving is a skill, and it's rarer than it looks. Most of the people and things trapped in the Sierra Madre can't leave. Some of them couldn't even if the doors were open, because they've been inside long enough that leaving has stopped being something they can conceive of. Sinclair's love letters to Vera Keyes are scattered throughout the casino, and reading them in sequence gives you the shape of a relationship that was, for one party at least, genuine. He built the whole thing for her. He designed the security systems to recognize her specifically. He wrote messages in the foundations of the building that could only be decoded by someone who knew what they were looking for. He was, in his own way, as obsessed as Elijah is, but his obsession was aimed at a person rather than at a system, and there's a tenderness in it that makes the Sierra Madre's horror feel specifically sad rather than simply dark. Vera Keyes didn't know about most of it. Or if she did, she didn't reciprocate to the same degree. She was an actress trying to find her footing in the world, using the Sierra Madre job as a means to an end, and the fact that the man she was working for had organized an entire architectural monument around his feelings for her was probably not something she fully understood until much later, if ever. The casino outlasted both of them and absorbed their stories into its walls, and now it glows in the cloud, a monument to love and obsession and loss that nobody who gets close enough to see it clearly is ever in a position to appreciate. Dead Money is Fallout at its most gothic, the genre-adjacent territory where horror is made of human feeling pushed past its sustainable limits, where the monsters are the products of devotion and desperation rather than the ordinary mechanisms of apocalyptic violence. It's a story about traps, and about the specific kind of trap that a person constructs around themselves without realizing they've done it. And the Sierra Madre sits in the cloud, its neon still functioning, its hologram still patrolling, waiting for someone else to stumble in and find out what being trapped feels like from the inside. Number. Supplemental Section E. The Brotherhood of Steel, Crusaders, Collectors, and the Weight of Old Technology. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of those factions in the Fallout universe that looks, at first encounter, like a straightforward good guy faction, armor-wearing paladins in power armor, fighting back the chaos of the wasteland with military discipline and impressive technology. The Brotherhood appears in every main game in the series, and in every game the relationship between them and the protagonist shifts depending on which Brotherhood chapter is present and what that chapter's priorities have become over the decades. The Brotherhood's origin story begins at Mariposa Military Base in 2077 on the day the bombs fell. Captain Roger Maxson, stationed at Mariposa, discovered in the weeks before the war that the scientists at the base had been conducting FEV experiments on unwilling civilian subjects. He executed the lead scientist, declared secession from the United States military, and led his soldiers into the nearby Californian hills when the bombs fell. He became High Elder of the organization that his group formed the Brotherhood of Steel, named for the armor they carried and the discipline they maintained. The Brotherhood's founding philosophy was the preservation of technology. Not the preservation of people, not the rebuilding of society, but the collection and protection of pre-war technological artifacts and scientific knowledge. Maxson believed that technology was the most valuable thing the pre-war world had produced, and that in the hands of people who didn't understand it, technology would kill everyone who survived the bombs. Therefore, the Brotherhood would collect technology, protect it, and control who had access to it. This is a coherent philosophy for the immediate post-war period. In the chaos of the early wasteland, with no stable institutions and no supply chains and no technical education infrastructure, the concentration of dangerous technology in the hands of disciplined people who understood its dangers was probably the least bad option available. The alternative loose pre-war weapons and energy sources distributed freely through a population of desperate, traumatized survivors would have produced more casualties than the bombs themselves. The problem with the Brotherhood's founding philosophy is that it's a response to a temporary crisis that became permanent doctrine. 200 years after the bombs fell, the Brotherhood is still collecting technology and still restricting access to it. But the crisis that justified the restriction no longer looks the same. The NCR has rebuilt political institutions. The followers of the apocalypse are training doctors and running literacy programs. The societies of the wasteland are, slowly and imperfectly, and at enormous human cost, rebuilding. And the Brotherhood is still hoarding. The Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood, the one the Courier encounters in New Vegas, led by Elder McNamara, and then potentially by Elder Hardin, depending on player choices, has been locked inside the Hidden Valley bunker for years, conducting a static defense of their position after a failed assault on NCR forces. They are functionally irrelevant to the balance of power in the Mojave, not because they lack the technology to be relevant, but because their institutional culture has calcified into siege mentality. They've decided that survival is the mission, and survival looks like staying in the bunker and not drawing attention, and this is what a faction looks like when its founding purpose has been replaced by the bureaucratic imperative of institutional continuity. The Capital Wasteland chapter in Fallout 3 is, by contrast, engaged. They're fighting the Enclave, patrolling the wasteland, making themselves visible. But Elder Lyons, who runs this chapter, is considered a heretic by the Brotherhood's leadership on the West Coast because he has departed from strict Brotherhood doctrine in a critical way. He is helping the people of the wasteland, not just collecting their technology. He's running an operation that prioritizes human welfare alongside technological acquisition. And the traditional Brotherhood finds this philosophically impure. What Lyons understood and what the Brotherhood has never found a way to institutionalize is that technology is not separable from the people who use it. Preserving technology while the population remains illiterate and malnourished is not preservation, it's storage. And storage, maintained long enough without a plan for eventual use, becomes an end in itself. And then the collectors are not the stewards of anything. They're just people with a lot of locked boxes. The Brotherhood of Steel's mystery is not what they've kept. It's what they've prevented from happening by keeping it. All the technology in their vaults and bunkers and armories, all the energy weapons and power armor and pre-war medical equipment and scientific instruments represents both the survival of something valuable and the withholding of something necessary. In the 200 years since the Great War, how many people have died of diseases that Brotherhood medical technology could have cured? How many communities have been destroyed by raiders armed with technology that Brotherhood acquisition reduced to a single organization's monopoly? How many problems have remained problems because the tools for solving them were locked away? This is the question that Fallout never directly asks but consistently implies, and it's the question that makes the Brotherhood more interesting as a faction than its surface presentation suggests. They are not simply good guys with good intentions who happen to be a bit rigid. They are an organization whose founding instinct was correct, and whose subsequent decades of institutional evolution have transformed that instinct into something that looks, from a sufficient distance, like hoarding. And the people inside the Brotherhood are, mostly, people who genuinely believe in the mission, who have grown up inside the philosophy and internalized it the way people internalize any culture they're raised in, which is completely and without much capacity for critical distance. The tragedy of the Brotherhood is that Maxon was right, and his successors have spent 2 centuries being right in a way that stopped serving the purpose the original rightness was supposed to serve. Number. Supplemental Section F. Lily and the Nightkin who remembered when a monster keeps a grandmother's voice. There is a holotape in Fallout, New Vegas that very few players hear completely, because hearing it requires a specific sequence of decisions about a companion named Lily Bowen, and the game doesn't draw your attention to it directly. But if you make those decisions, if you choose, against the mechanical incentive to reduce Lily's medication dosage rather than increasing it, you eventually hear the recording that Lily has been carrying for decades, the voice of her grandchildren, recorded before the Master's army captured her and transformed her into a super mutant. Lily Bowen was a grandmother. This is important. She had grandchildren who called her grandma, who recorded a short message on a holotape because she was going away and they wanted her to have something to listen to while she was gone. She was seized by the Master's forces, infected with FEV, transformed into a Nightkin, one of the large, intimidating, stealth field-using super mutant soldiers who were the most capable units in the Master's army. Her mind was affected the way Nightkin minds are affected. The psychosis came. The dependency on stealth boys came. The dissociation and the paranoia and the violent impulses came. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she kept her grandchildren's holotape. And she developed a split personality, one part the confused, gentle grandmother who looks at everything around her with an uncertain benevolence, and one part Leo, an aggressive Nightkin personality who surfaces when she's threatened or when she's been without her medication for too long. Leo is, in some sense, what the FEV transformation was supposed to produce. A soldier, capable of violence, organized around aggression. The grandmother part is what survived from before. The tension of Lily's storyline is not dramatic in the conventional sense. It's quietly devastating. The medication she takes suppresses Leo keeps the violent Nightkin personality from surfacing, but it also suppresses the memories from before. The memories of her grandchildren, of what her life was before the Master's army took it, of who she was when she was a person rather than an experiment. The medication makes her safer to be around and harder to hurt, and it costs her the people she loved most. If you tell her not to take her medication, she remembers. She becomes harder to travel with Leo surfaces more often, and the violence escalates, but she holds on to the memories, plays the holotape, calls you dear in the voice of someone's grandmother, who is very confused about how she got to the desert, but is trying to make the best of it. If you tell her to take the full dose, she's stable and Leo is quiet and the holotape stays in her pocket and she doesn't take it out. The game doesn't tell you what the right answer is. The design of this choice is not about good versus evil or even safety versus memory. It's about what you value in a person's inner life, and about whether the version of Lily that can function safely in the world is more valuable than the version of Lily that can remember what she lost. It's a companion questline built around a philosophical question that the game genuinely doesn't answer for you. Lily is not unique in the Fallout world in being a person who survived their own transformation. Joshua Graham survived physical burning. The Nightkins survived the Stealth Boy dependency in various states of deterioration. The synths of the Institute survived being built from nothing into something that might be a person. But Lily is unique in the specific form her survival takes, not traumatized toughness, not philosophical reconstruction, not the building of new identity over the ruins of the old, but a literal split. Two people in one body, one the product of what was done to her, and one the remnant of who she was before. She calls every large person dear. She is genuinely kind when Leo isn't surfacing, with the particular kindness of someone who has been affectionate for a long time and can't entirely turn it off even when everything else about her has been changed. She killed people as a Nightkin soldier in large numbers with the efficiency of a trained and FEV-enhanced super mutant, and she holds a holotape of her grandchildren's voices and plays it when she's alone. The mystery of Lily is not a plot mystery. It's a character mystery, which is harder to resolve and more important. Who is she really? Is she the grandmother, the pre-transformation identity that the medication suppresses but doesn't eliminate? Is she Leo, the FEV-produced Nightkin, who surfaces when the medication runs low, who the biological fact of her current form was designed to produce? Is she the person who has been managing the coexistence of these two identities for decades, the survivor who keeps a piece of her past in her pocket and travels through the desert offering it to people who need it? The holotape at the end of the low medication questline is not a revelation in the narrative sense. It's a quieter thing than that. It's a grandmother listening to her grandchildren's voices in the desert 200 years after the war that took her from them, in a body she would never have chosen, holding on to something small and real in a world that has destroyed almost everything small and real. That's not a mystery with a solution. It's a mystery that resolves into an ache. Number. Supplemental Section G. The Railroad Abolitionists in the Rust. There is something about the railroad that the game never fully commits to examining, which is the question of whether their position on synth consciousness is justified by anything other than a philosophical preference. They believe synths are people. They believe the Institute's creation and use of synths constitutes slavery. They have dedicated their organization at considerable cost to their members, many of whom have died for this belief, to freeing synths and giving them new identities and new lives outside the Institute's reach. The question the game doesn't push on as hard as it could is, how do they know? How does the railroad know that third-generation synths are conscious in the morally relevant sense that there's something it's like to be one of them, that they have experiences that matter in the way that persons' experiences matter? The question isn't rhetorical, it's genuinely difficult, and the philosophers who have spent careers on questions of consciousness and AI and personhood have not reached consensus. The railroad's position is essentially that if something behaves as though it's conscious, if it forms relationships, if it has preferences, if it responds to its circumstances in ways that suggest an inner life, then the uncertainty about its actual inner life is not sufficient reason to treat it as though it definitely doesn't have one. The cost of being wrong in one direction, treating a conscious being as a tool, is higher than the cost of being wrong in the other direction, treating a sophisticated tool as a person. Therefore, err toward personhood. This is, as moral arguments go, a reasonable one. It's also an argument that the Institute's scientists would recognize and reject, not because they're evil, but because they've decided that the burden of proof runs the other direction, that consciousness is a specific biological phenomenon, and that its presence in synthetic beings would require evidence of a particular kind, evidence that behavior alone doesn't provide. They're not indifferent to the question. They've just resolved it differently. What makes the Railroad interesting as a faction, and what Fallout 4 doesn't quite have the structural room to fully develop, is the parallel to the historical abolitionist movement. The game draws this parallel explicitly in the Railroad's aesthetics and terminology. They use the same language: railroad, conductor, safe house. They operate in the same cell structure. They take the same kinds of institutional risks. They believe they're fighting for the freedom of beings who are being exploited by a system that has decided their personhood is not relevant to the economic and scientific logic of their use. The historical abolitionists were, in retrospect, obviously right. Slavery was evil. The enslaved were people. The arguments that attempted to deny their personhood were rationalizations for economic convenience and social hierarchy. The Railroad is betting that they are in the same position, that history will vindicate them, that the synths will turn out to have been people all along, and that the Institute will turn out to have been a sophisticated slave state dressed up in the language of scientific advancement. The unsettling thing is that the game doesn't confirm this. It puts the question forward and leaves it genuinely open. The synths you meet who have been freed and given new lives? Curie, who was originally a Miss Nanny robot but gets her consciousness transferred into a synth body. Nick Valentine, who has the memories of a pre-war detective. Various escaped synths. The Railroad has helped all of them behave in ways consistent with consciousness. But the game doesn't have the philosophical machinery to close the question, and it knows it doesn't. The Railroad fights for synth freedom because it's the right thing to do if synths are conscious. They might be wrong about synths being conscious. They might be right. And the decision to act on the possibility of consciousness in the absence of certainty is itself the moral argument they're making, that the uncertainty is not an excuse for inaction, and that the beings in question deserve the benefit of the doubt. Desdemona, who leads the Railroad, is one of the most quietly certain characters in Fallout 4, certain not in a way that denies complexity, but in the way of someone who has already worked through the complexity and arrived at a position they can maintain under pressure. She's been running this operation long enough to know exactly what it costs, and she keeps running it. And the certainty that motivates her is moral rather than empirical. She doesn't know that synths are people. She has decided to act as though they are. The Railroad's final missions involve infiltrating the Institute and triggering its self-destruct sequence. If you've been working with them throughout the game, you're the person who carries out both the infiltration and the detonation. The Institute, with all its research and all its synths and all its decades of work, is destroyed. The question of whether the synths were people goes unanswered, because the institution that created them is gone, and the synths who survive have already been given new lives and new memories and new names. They are the ghosts of the question, walking around in new bodies, and the question itself sank into the nuclear fire under the earth beneath Boston. The Railroad won. But the question they were asking remains open in the specific way that questions about consciousness always remain open. Not because they're unanswerable in principle, but because we haven't yet built the tools to answer them definitively. And in the Fallout universe, those tools were buried with the world that might have built them. Number. Supplemental Section H. Nick Valentine's past two men in one body. Nick Valentine is a synth detective who operates out of Diamond City, the baseball stadium turned settlement that serves as the hub of the Commonwealth's social life. He has the memories of a pre-war Boston police detective named Nick Valentine, memories that include a fiancée named Jenny whose fate he carries with him in the specific way of a person who never got to say goodbye. He has the face of an old man, not an organic face but an artificial one, aged and weathered-looking in the aesthetic language of pulp detective fiction, the kind of face that's been designed to invoke Humphrey Bogart and the whole tradition of the hard-bitten investigator who has seen everything and found it all disappointing. The human Nick Valentine, the original, the person whose memories are now stored in a synthetic brain, was a decent man trying to do a decent thing in an indecent world. He was a detective in Boston in the years before the war, and he got involved with a woman named Jenny, and Jenny was killed by a man named Eddie Winter, a gangster who used her death as a message to the detective who was getting too close to his operation. Nick Valentine, before the war, spent the years he had left trying to take Eddie Winter down, and he mostly failed. And then the bombs fell and he ended up, somehow, in the Institute's early experimental archive. What the Institute did, why they had the memories of a specific pre-war detective, what purpose they intended the memories to serve is never fully explained. The theory that Nick's dialogue suggests is that the Institute was experimenting with memory implantation in early synths, trying to create a more human behavioral framework by giving synths the recorded memories of actual humans. Valentine was one of the test cases. Something went wrong or right, depending on your perspective, and he came out the other side with a coherent identity built around someone else's memories and a strong enough sense of self to eventually escape the Institute and find his way to Diamond City. Nick knows the memories aren't his, in the literal sense. They came from someone else's brain, recorded before the war, transplanted into his synthetic consciousness. But they are his. In the functional sense, they are the substrate from which his personality and his values and his relationships with other people are built. When he thinks about Jenny, he's thinking about a woman who died before the war, whose relationship with a human detective he will never meet has shaped him into someone who cares about loss and about justice and about the specific satisfaction of solving a case that matters. The memory is his inheritance, and he's made it his own. The case file on the mysterious stranger, found under Nick's bed, is one of the most humanizing details in Fallout 4 because it shows a detective doing what detectives do, following a thread because the thread is there, because something doesn't add up, because the mystery of a man who shows up across decades and geographic distances without apparent aging and without any verifiable identity is exactly the kind of case that a good detective can't let go of. Nick can't solve it. He knows he can't solve it, but he keeps the file because the file is what a detective does. The mystery of Nick Valentine is ultimately the mystery of what makes a person, of whether the memories and values and relationships that constitute a self can be transmitted between biological and artificial substrates without losing the thing that makes them a self. Nick behaves as though he is the inheritor of something real and valuable, and he treats that inheritance with a kind of respect that is both touching and philosophically sophisticated. He is not the original Nick Valentine. He is the person that the original Nick Valentine's memories produced when planted in a synthetic mind, and that person has turned out to be someone worth knowing. His questline helping him take down Eddie Winter, the gangster who killed Jenny decades before the war, is one of Fallout 4's quieter narratives. The confrontation with Winter, who was himself given a chemical treatment before the war that made him ghoul-like without making him feral, allows Nick to do something that the original human Nick Valentine never could: finish the case. The bones of the story are pulp detective fiction, and the resolution is appropriately pulp the bad guy confronted, the mystery closed, the detective left standing over the evidence of what he came to do. But there's something underneath the pulp bones that the game handles with unusual tenderness. Nick standing in the ruins of a gangster's hideout, holding the resolution of a case that technically belonged to a dead man, and having to figure out what it means to him that the case is closed. The human Nick Valentine died without getting justice for Jenny. The synthetic Nick Valentine got it for him. Whether that counts as justice, whether it satisfies the grief of the memories, whether finishing someone else's story can be genuinely fulfilling to the person finishing it is a question the game leaves open. The way the best questions are left open, with enough room for the player's own emotional architecture to settle into. Nick lights a cigarette, a habit carried forward from the original's memories, a detail that is entirely without practical function for a synthetic being, and entirely coherent as the behavior of someone who inherited the social and physical habits of a lifetime and looks out at the Commonwealth. And the case is closed. Whatever that means for a man made of someone else's past? Number. Supplemental Section 1. The followers of the apocalypse idealism that keeps showing up. In the taxonomy of Fallout factions, the followers of the apocalypse occupy an unusual position. They are not militarized. They do not control territory. They do not have a political agenda in the sense of seeking to govern or influence governance. They are a humanitarian organization, operating in a world where humanitarianism is simultaneously desperately needed and almost entirely unsupported by the incentive structures of wasteland politics. They run medical clinics, they operate literacy programs, they research agricultural and medical techniques and distribute the knowledge freely. They go into war zones and try to help the people caught in the middle of them. They've been doing this since the early post-war period, And the fact that they're still doing it 210 years later is either a testament to the durability of human idealism or evidence that the problems they're trying to address have proven impervious to 2 centuries of effort. Both readings are true simultaneously, and the followers are sophisticated enough to know it. The followers' idealism is not naive, which is the most important thing to understand about them. They are not operating under the assumption that goodness is easy or that the suffering they're addressing will be solved by the application of sufficient benevolence. They work in the specific way of people who understand that they can't fix everything and have decided to fix what they can reach. They know the limits of their resources and their organizational capacity, and the political reality of the wasteland. They keep working anyway. In Fallout, New Vegas, the followers are present in multiple locations in Freeside, the poverty-stricken district just outside the New Vegas Strip, where they run a clinic and provide what medical care they can to the people who can't afford Strip medical services. In Jacobstown, helping the super mutants understand their own condition. In various other locations across the Mojave, their representative, Julie Farkas, runs the Freeside Clinic with the particular competence of someone who has been managing scarcity for a long time and has gotten very good at making resources stretch further than they should. The followers' position in the politics of the Mojave and in the final battle of New Vegas is shaped by their refusal to be weaponized. Every major faction tries to recruit them or use them or subordinate their goals to the faction's own agenda. The NCR wants their logistical support. Caesar's Legion would eliminate them as a corrupting influence on their slave society. House would use them as a PR asset while giving them nothing in return. The independent path offers them the most genuine opportunity to maintain their mission, but it also offers the least structural protection. The mystery of the followers, if they have one, is how an organization operating entirely on idealism and voluntary donation manages to survive in an environment as hostile to both idealism and voluntary donation as the post-war world. The answer seems to be, with difficulty, and because enough people in enough places recognize that what the followers do is irreplaceable. In the absence of any other institution dedicated purely to the welfare of the worst off, the followers fill a function that the political factions cannot or will not fill. They're not popular. They're not powerful. They're necessary, in the way that things that nobody else is doing are necessary. There is something in the followers' persistence that the games use as a quiet counter-argument to the nihilism that the post-war world's worst aspects can produce. The world is terrible in very specific ways, and has been terrible in those ways for 200 years, and the followers keep showing up with medical supplies and books, and the patience of people who have decided that showing up is its own argument for showing up. They lose more than they win, but they keep coming back, which is the characteristic behavior of a belief that has more resilience than the circumstances arrayed against it. Number. Supplemental section. J. The Long Night of Caesar's Legion. Why Rome Failed Again. Caesar Edward Sallow built his empire on the study of failure. He believed he understood why Rome fell, and he designed his legion to avoid the failures that brought the original down. He enforced discipline with absolute severity. He eliminated corruption by making corruption's consequences existential. He maintained cultural homogeneity by destroying the cultures of the tribes he conquered. He created a fighting force of extraordinary capability by treating everything else, economy, governance, diplomacy, the welfare of the non-soldier population, as subordinate to military excellence. The Legion works, in the specific sense that it has expanded from a single desperate tribe at the Grand Canyon into a vast empire dominating the American Southwest. The Legion has won battles that nobody expected it to win. It has conquered territories that conventional analysis suggested were unconquerable. It has maintained internal cohesion, despite its brutal internal discipline, to a degree that would shame any other post-war political organization. And it is going to fail. Caesar knows this, and the terminal entries and dialogue that document his private thinking make it clear that he knows it. The Legion is not sustainable past the military generation that built it. The model of perpetual war and expansion runs out of room eventually. Either the Legion's expansion hits a natural boundary it can't cross, or it encounters an opponent capable of defeating it, or the internal contradictions of a society organized entirely around military conquest begin to create the kind of instability that cannot be managed by severity alone. Caesar's plan, the plan he hasn't shared with his legion, because the plan requires the legion to be transformed into something the legion would not choose to be, was to use Hoover Dam as a pivot point. Capture the dam. Control the power it generates. Use that power as the foundation for a transition from military conquest to settled governance. The Legion, he believed, could become Rome, not the Rome of the Republic or the late Empire, but the Rome of Trajan and Hadrian, the administered empire that translated military victory into lasting civilization. The tribes and peoples the Legion had absorbed would become, over time, genuinely integrated into a new culture, the way Rome's conquered peoples had eventually become Roman. This plan required a victory at Hoover Dam. The first battle, the one the Malpais legate lost, was a setback that delayed the plan. The second battle, which is the context of the game's main storyline, is Caesar's attempt to recover the situation. He is dying a brain tumor that the Legion's medical capabilities cannot adequately address, and he is racing against his own mortality to secure the foundation his empire needs to outlast him. Without a settled power base, the Legion collapses when Caesar dies. Because the Legion is, in its current form, a personality cult with military infrastructure. The personality at the center is going. What Fallout New Vegas does with this material, with the question of whether Caesar's vision, however monstrous its methods, could have produced something that outlasted the cruelty of its construction, is to leave it genuinely uncertain. The Legion ending, in which the courier sides with Caesar and helps him take the dam, is not unambiguously evil. It's an ending that takes the most seriously the possibility that Caesar's analysis of what the wasteland needs is correct, that the period of brutal consolidation is a necessary transition rather than an end in itself, that the suffering caused by the Legion's conquest is the price of a stability that would otherwise not exist. Whether you believe that depends on what you think about the relationship between political violence and political order, about whether ends justify means in situations of genuine civilizational crisis, about whether a person who has thought carefully about history and governance can be trusted to impose their thinking on other people through force. These are not simple questions, and the game is honest about their difficulty. The mystery of Caesar's Legion is not whether it's evil. In the ways that matter most to the people living under it, it clearly is. The mystery is whether it could have become something that isn't, whether the pivot from conquest to administration that Caesar envisioned was ever actually possible, or whether the institution was too thoroughly organized around violence to survive the attempt at transformation. Rome, after all, did eventually fall, despite centuries of administrative sophistication. Caesar is betting that he has understood what Rome did wrong. History, in the Fallout universe, suggests that he has not. Final line of the script: these mysteries live in the world of Fallout, the way the best mysteries live in the best stories, not as problems to be solved, but as textures to be inhabited. Questions that are interesting because they're genuinely hard. The wasteland keeps its secrets. The obelisk waits in the dark. The mysterious stranger tips his hat to no one and disappears. And somewhere out in the desert, a woman named Lily keeps a holotape in her pocket and listens to it when the night gets very quiet. Number. Supplemental Section K. The Ghoul Across Time, Cooper Howard, and What 200 Years Does to a Person. When the Fallout television series introduced Cooper Howard, the pre-war actor who becomes the post-war ghoul, it gave the broader franchise something it had never quite had before: a continuous perspective across the entirety of the 200-year gap between the bombs falling and the present of the games. Cooper was there when the world was whole. He was there when it ended. And he's been walking through the ruins ever since, which gives him the particular vantage point of someone who remembers what was lost with absolute clarity and has had 200 years to watch the world fail to recover it. The transformation from Cooper Howard to the Ghoul is not fully explained in the first season of the show, and the second season adds layers without entirely resolving the mystery of how he survived the radiation that ghouls generally require for their transformation. What's clear is that the transformation was not fast and not comfortable, and that the Cooper who emerged from it was the same person as the Cooper who went in the way that fundamental character survives radical circumstance damaged, altered in ways that required decades to accept, but essentially the same self that had always been looking at the world with a particular mix of pragmatism and latent idealism. What the Ghoul represents in the Fallout universe is something the games had always implied but never quite embodied: the cost of survival across the full span of the Wasteland's history. The ghouls who appear in the games are, for the most part, context-free. They're there, they've been there, they've adapted, and the games don't spend much time with the subjective experience of what those 2 centuries have been like. Cooper Howard's storyline asks that question directly, and the answer it arrives at is not comfortable. 200 years of watching a world try and mostly fail to rebuild leaves marks? Not just physical marks, the ghoul's physical deterioration is visible and significant, but marks on the way you process other people's suffering, on your capacity for hope, on your willingness to invest emotionally in outcomes that the next 200 years might simply erase. Cooper Howard was a decent man. This is the show's essential claim about him, and it matters because it's the foundation of the tragedy. He was an actor who genuinely believed in the optimistic mythology of American culture that his career was built on promoting. He was a father who loved his daughter. He was a person trying to navigate a world that was clearly going wrong and trying to find where his responsibilities in that situation lay. His decency made the transformation harder and, paradoxically, necessary for what came after. If he had been a simpler person, a person without the capacity for the kind of grief that genuine loss requires, the 200 years might have been easier. Instead, he's a person who remembers exactly what was lost, and the memory is specific and human and it doesn't fade. The mystery of the ghoul, the version of Cooper Howard that the games and the second season of the show present, is the question of what survives the complete destruction of everything you cared about, everything you were oriented toward, everything that organized your sense of purpose and meaning. The answer the show is constructing seems to be something. Something survives. Not necessarily something intact or healthy or reconciled to its own survival, but something that is still, underneath the deterioration and the centuries of hard choices, the person who started the journey. This is the same mystery that runs through Joshua Graham and through Nick Valentine and through every Fallout character who has to figure out who they are after the world has done its worst to them. The wasteland is not kind to self-conception. It strips things away. The question that the franchise keeps asking, across its many stories and iterations, is what's left when the stripping is done? What's the irreducible minimum of a person? And does that minimum, whatever it is, have any value? Cooper Howard's answer is still being written. The ghoul walks on, through a world that he remembers as something else, and the story isn't finished yet. Number. Supplemental Section L. Deathclaws, the weapon that became the apocalypse's most famous symbol. No creature in the Fallout universe is more immediately recognizable than the Deathclaw. Tall, scaled, immensely powerful, with sickle-shaped talons on each hand that give them their name and their reputation, Deathclaws appear in every Fallout game as the encounter that experienced players know to avoid, and new players learn to avoid the hard way. They are the signature animal of the post-nuclear American landscape, as associated with Fallout's aesthetic identity as anything else in the franchise. What they are, in the biological sense, is a chimera, a species that doesn't exist in nature because it was never produced by nature. Before the Great War, Deathclaws were engineered by the United States military as a replacement for human soldiers in close-quarters combat. They were made from Jackson's chameleons, a specific species of lizard, and subjected to the forced evolutionary virus and various other experimental alterations. The FEV expanded them dramatically in size, enhanced their strength and resilience, and apparently introduced genetic material from other sources. The exact composition of a Deathclaw's genetic heritage is one of those technical details the games never fully resolve, but the result is an animal optimized for violence at close range. The military never got to deploy them, because the war ended. The Deathclaws that were in development were released or escaped from their containment, and in the centuries that followed, they adapted with impressive speed to the post-nuclear environment. By the time the games are set, Deathclaws have spread across the former continental United States, developing regional variations that reflect the specific environments they've adapted to. The California Deathclaws are different from the Mojave Deathclaws, which are different from the Commonwealth Deathclaws. The adaptability that the FEV introduced, the biological plasticity that makes FEV-affected creatures so variable, has allowed Deathclaws to colonize environments across a vast geographic range. In Fallout 2, a specific group of Deathclaws received the additional modification of enhanced intelligence. Their cognitive capacity was deliberately increased to near-human levels as part of an Enclave experiment. The intelligent Deathclaws in Vault 13 can speak. They have a social structure. They have an elder who acts as a mediator and a philosophical voice for the community. They have a relationship with the Vault's overseer that is, given the circumstances, remarkably civil. The intelligent Deathclaws are one of Fallout 2's most surprising encounters. Because the game uses them to ask a question, it applies to several different species across the franchise. When does a modified animal become a person? The death claws in Vault 13 are intelligent enough to reason, to communicate, to make moral arguments about their own situation and the situation of the people around them. They have social bonds. They have, apparently, something that functions like ethics. The game doesn't resolve the personhood question, it can't. For the same reason, none of the games can fully resolve the synth consciousness question, but it poses it with unusual directness. The Enclave eventually discovers and exterminates the intelligent Deathclaws, because from their perspective, the Deathclaws represent a contamination of the experimental baseline. If the goal is to restore a pre-war human civilization, there is no room for a competing intelligence, regardless of how that intelligence was produced or what it's capable of. The extinction of the Vault 13 Deathclaw community is one of the crimes the Enclave is held accountable for in Fallout 2, a quiet atrocity nestled among larger ones. The standard Deathclaw, the non-intelligent version that appears in every game, carries its own mystery, which is the mystery of any apex predator in an environment that wasn't designed to have one. The wasteland ecosystems have reorganized around Deathclaws in ways that are not fully documented but can be inferred. They've pushed other large predators into specific niches. They've affected human settlement patterns, making certain areas effectively uninhabitable and pushing communities toward locations with natural defensive advantages. They've been the direct cause of the abandonment of multiple settlements and the indirect cause of many more decisions about where human life in the wasteland can be sustained. They are the military's most lasting contribution to the post-war world, which is an observation that carries its own dark commentary. A civilization defined in its final years by warfare produced, as its most enduring legacy, an apex predator that has been running the landscape for 2 centuries. The bombs fell and the cities burned and the political institutions collapsed, and the Deathclaws are still out there, still as dangerous as the day they were made, still the first thing anyone mentions when they describe what it's like to travel alone in the Fallout world. The military that created them is gone. The country that funded their development is gone. The specific war they were supposed to fight is long over, its outcome irrelevant in a world where both sides lost. But the Deathclaws endure, because endurance is what they were built for, and the world that survives is the world that's built for the conditions of survival, rather than the conditions of civilization. Good night. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up.